KnockBack, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to KnockBack. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined as always by my brother Dagan, the director Moriarty. Dagan, how are you today?
That was my clapper. Hi, guys. Ooh, that was a high-pitched one.
Yeah, it was.
I shocked myself with that one.
I had a little bit of a pregnant pause there as well, just to give it a little bit of a dramatic flair. But
not bad.
Today's nickname that I gave you is with good reason. I want to jump right into this because it's exciting news. You've taken on a new role in the animation industry, and you begin that role shortly. So I wanted to give you a stage real quick to tell the audience what you're doing because it's very exciting.
Wow, thanks, dude. Yeah, so after 10 years at my current job at Sesame Workshop as an animator and sometimes art director and character designer, I've taken on a new role at a brand new animation studio. Actually, the studio's been around for 20 something years, but it's brand new to me as an animation director on a brand new preschool animated series. And I'm very excited because I've never served as an animation director before, Carl. So this is a brand new thing for me. Very cute show. I can't say too much about it yet, but of course I'll reveal details on social media and talking about it on the show over the next few months, I'm sure. But yeah, really excited. I start on Monday, gave the current job the old 4 weeks notice. Went very quickly, actually. When the time actually really flew since I first gave my notice to Sesame. So yeah, I'm very excited about the new gig, man. I have high expectations. I think I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself. The show is largely beholden. The success of the show, the quality of the show is largely beholden to the director. I'm working underneath the head of the studio who created the show. He's an awesome dude. So I'm really psyched, man. Thank you for the acknowledgement.
Yeah, it's big. I mean, it's big. It's a big deal. And you're leaving your Emmy award-winning position at Sesame after a decade, so that's a big deal. I mean, I remember what it's like. I only had one big job in the corporate world. You've had a few, but it's hard to walk away from a job that you are comfortable at.
Yes. The comfort is a hard thing to walk away from, and just forming new relationships, going through the throes of any new, we could all relate, any new job. And somebody that we know has labeled me in the past as risk averse. I'm not going to say who we're talking about here. I'm not going to say. You guys could infer. You guys could make your own guesses as to that. So this is partially for that. It's partially for you, Kyle. Let's just be honest. This is partially for you.
Well, I didn't mean it as an insult. I mean, being risk averse is good, but you needed someone to push you towards taking one of the many opportunities that have come up in the past. I mean, it's not like this is like you took the first thing that came your way. It took some time for you to accept something. And I just know what it's like to be risk averse, and yet you reach those moments where you have to.
Yes, absolutely. No, I mean, you're right. I am notoriously risk averse. I'm not a gambler, but yeah, for this thing, it's like, it was that thing. It was time, the planets seemed to align. I just felt like, sometimes when you feel froggy, you got to leap.
Yeah.
Shout out to Dad.
Isn't that the truth? And well, it's interesting. I usually think no one listens to anything I say. So it's nice that something we joke around. Derek and I especially joke around. We miss you here because we have so many funny kind of embryonic jokes brewing that are definitely going somewhere. And one of them is that no one in the family can stop giving someone advice when they bring something up. So I just don't talk anymore at family functions because like anything that I introduce suddenly, Aunt Carla is John Smith. I'm sorry, John Smith, Adam Smith, and she understands the economy, better than anyone. And then Uncle Mike's got some insight, and I appreciate all this. Derek's chiming, and Dana's got her insight, and everyone's got something to say.
Sure.
And so I'm just like, I can't do it anymore. Because like when I was I don't think I ever even told you this. When I was gonna rename the company, I made the mistake of telling everyone that at a family event, and then had to go through what felt like, and I think was hours of notes and also advice. No offense.
No,
I'm the only entrepreneur in the family. Allie's kind of budding now, which is good.
Yeah,
she's doing her little, she's got a little e-commerce kind of boutique going on. I have great promise. Yeah. But you would think that people would come to me for that kind of advice.
Yes.
You know, this is the third business I've started.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah. So Derek's the only other one that really finds that funny because like when I bring up Rush or something, he's like, oh, I got some advice for you. You know?
Could be anything now.
Yeah.
He's got to step
Derek's
in
our
with
brother-in-law,
the advice.
by the way.
You know, the advice from the family does, you know, as you know, comes from a place of love. But yeah, it's like, yeah, it's pretty fun. I mean, that's pretty funny. I actually wish I was privy to those conversations because I think I would definitely get a kick out of that. I definitely would not be chiming in with advice. I'm just not the type to do that.
Me neither. I mean, that's the thing is like, I don't know that I've given any of you advice on anything because I assume if you wanted, you would ask. But the second I bring up
asked for is different.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Everyone has like, you know, everyone went to Penn for fucking economics in the company, you know, in the family, in the firm.
Well, it is like a company.
Look at my little slime.
There he is, DQ.
So, all right. I wanted to ask you, have we talked about the actor Wallace Shawn on this show before?
We have not. I don't even know who that is.
You do. And
okay.
I was thinking about this.
Okay.
Google him real quick while I talk to you.
All right, let me
You
Google.
can do it. Yeah. If you have your, you know, computer, you know,
it's
Google.
right here.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring him up because I feel like he's one of those actors that I feel like you really like.
Of course I know who this is.
Yeah. So he's I think T-Rex or whatever in Toy Story, but he's famous. So the role I actually love him the most in is I like him in Clueless as the teacher. I think he's awesome in that movie. But he's of course in Princess Bride, you know, famously.
That's right.
And a lot of other 80s movies. But I just thought of him because when I was looking at something, I'm like, I bet you Dagan has something to say about this guy, but maybe you don't because, you know, so every once in a while you're a lover of character actors and
yes.
And he's one of them. So I just wanted to, it has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but that's what I wanted to bring up today was what you think of this guy.
He's so funny.
Because I don't think he's ever come up.
He never does. I never hear him talked about in conversation, hence not knowing his name, but he's such a face, you know, and he's a big character actor. I mean, I think he's particularly emblematic of the 80s. But you know what's also interesting about this guy? And I think this is a recurring theme. I'm starting to sense this is a recurring theme for me on the show. For me, I have like every actor I have a doppelganger for that I get them confused with. Sure. And they don't always make sense. You know, we talked about one last week. What was it? Or on the Blade Runner episode. Oh, it was Dolph Lundgren and
the guy who played yeah, I'll keep going. I'll look it up for you.
Yeah. What? And you know, the guy who played the replicant and Blade Runner. Why am I spacing out? Which makes absolutely no sense. You know, those two make absolutely no sense.
It's like some vague weird connection that you made. The replicant is Rutger Hauer.
Right, of course. And like there's no reason. And now I also do the same thing with Patrick Swayze and Russell Crowe. Doesn't make any sense.
That doesn't make any sense.
No sense. But I literally would stumble on those two actors and get them confused like my whole life. This guy, this Wallace Shawn guy, I get confused with Ron Howard's brother. What is his name? Is it Philip Howard?
Yeah, I mean Ron
another character
Howard
actor,
brother.
Another very 80s actor. But when you look at them,
Clint
you're like,
Howard.
No.
Yeah. Clint Howard.
Right?
Yeah.
Who pops up? He's always popping up in little cameo roles, and he's like almost like the cameo guy, Clint Howard. But even when you look at Wallace Shawn and Clint Howard together, like that doesn't really compute to get those two. I mean, I might as well be getting Wallace Shawn confused with, you know, Jennifer Aniston, like something ridiculous. Like it doesn't make any sense. So I wonder if as I get older, those are going to get more exaggerated, where I'm going to get Jennifer Aniston confused with like Mike Myers or something, you know, like because I don't know how it could get any worse, but it might. But this is a face, and you're right. He does play Dinosaur in the Toy Story movies. I don't think I've ever made that connection before.
Yeah, I mean that's and I actually when I was reading about him earlier, I didn't know this. I mean, this is going to really screw because I know you have a soft spot for. I don't know if we're allowed to really talk about it anymore. You know what I'm going to bring up? The Cosby Show.
Oh, you know, it's funny. I was thinking about this today.
Yeah, he's in a role, like a recurring role in that show, which I had totally forgotten about over like years. So
I remember that. Is he one of the jazz musicians?
He's let me see if I can find
friends with his dad. Friends with the dad or the father-in-law. I'm not sure. Or is he a doctor?
Yeah, I think you're right
colleague?
actually about that. Yeah, he plays Jeff Engels. So yeah, I think you're right because it's over also 87 to 91. I totally forgot the dad because that's another classic like face. That guy rules.
Oh,
yeah.
so good.
We can't talk about that. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about the Cosby Show anymore.
It would
actually be fun to do a show on the Cosby Show, but I don't know what we're allowed to do with that anymore. I don't know if you're even really allowed to watch it. Yeah.
There's a statute of limitations. I guess there's such a thing as too soon. We do a YouTube show. That's definitely a notion that exists. But it came up for me today as I was writing notes because I was thinking about hip hop music. We're going to talk about the 90s today. And I'm thinking about my best friend, your very good friend, PJ, makes fun of my the rap selections that I tend to enjoy and refers to the rap music that I like as Bill Cosby rap. In other words, saying the rap music I like is soft, it's not hard enough, type of thing. But now I think Bill Cosby rap might take on a whole nother meaning.
Oh my God. I mean,
the opposite way now.
Right? It very rapidly went into a dark place. Yeah. With the Bill Cosby rap moniker. He came up with some pretty good monikers. 15 years ago,
Bill Cosby rap was something else.
PJ also came up with the moniker, which I love, and we brought it up on the show. He came up with the moniker, as far as I understand, adventure metal, which is one of my favorite,
I don't know if I've ever
like
heard
Iced
that.
Earth and all of those like bands that sound like, Tolkien.
That's a great
an accompaniment to Tolkien. He calls it adventure metal. And I actually didn't know that wasn't like a real genre until like I said it to some people and they're like, that's not a genre.
What is that? That's a PJ thing, a PJ-ism. He has his moments of genius.
Yeah.
He definitely does.
Sure.
But that's enough praising PJ for now.
Yeah,
he watches and I don't want to swell his head up.
All right. Oh, by the way, I also want to ask you, I see you're kind of getting some things in the background there in your shot. You got a candle going?
I do have a candle going back there. I like the smell.
Some of your decks? Oh, good.
I have some of the decks back there. I was doing a little spring cleaning. I figure new job. I'm going to be on a lot of Zoom calls, obviously, right? In our COVID society at the moment. So got to and I see a Sesame Street jacket back there. That's got to go. That's definitely got to go.
Pop
no offense, Sesame, but that's not. Yeah. That was yesterday.
No offense. Yeah, no, you definitely don't want. Yeah, you want to start on the right foot,
right? So I'm working on it back there. But I see a lot of people complaining about the backgrounds in the shows, particularly that Colin doesn't know how to hang up his posters.
No, not yet. Well, I hung up. Did you see? Oh, you saw it on Twitter. I actually hung one up, but you can't even. Ironically, it's the only thing hanging in my office you cannot see because I'm looking at it right now.
You're looking at it in that direction.
It's the old Colin's, like my first Colin's Last Stand poster, like the original one.
That's a classic.
The original company. Yeah. So I have. Yeah, there's like some classic stuff that I'm hanging up. But yeah, no, I don't. It's not that I don't know how, although I don't. It's that I am really persnickety. I'm up there with like the level. All right, one more thing, and then
please. Got a fuzz here.
I didn't realize that like there, and I was reading about this a little bit. That like so I obsessed over this picture frame being level right in the corner. And I hung it kind of high, and then I was like, this is totally level, but it doesn't look right. And then I used the level, and I'm like, oh, the ceiling's actually like dipping just a little bit, like just ever so slightly. And I was like, oh, I'm like, is this normal? And then I started reading about it. And I'm like, yeah, oh my God, it is normal. And then it started like really annoying me. And I started going around the house with my level, trying to find anything else that was uneven, and almost nothing was. And then, so I just selected putting the picture in the like too high towards the top in the one room where you can notice it. So now I have a nail hole below it where, depending on the mood I'm in, I can either dip the picture down to be even with the ceiling or dip it so it is level. And I have those options.
Okay, I like it. Yeah. I like being able to have a variety of options. That drove
really me nuts, though. I needed to let you guys know that.
That's OCD.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a thing, man. I'll drive you nuts. Go outside tomorrow in the daylight and look at your house from the outside and check out like things like your gutters. Now, gutters are supposed to be pitched a little bit, but you never think about that. So when you look at because they have to drain water.
Right.
So they're always pitched at a very slight angle. And you never notice it because you're never really looking at it. And that's not something you catch in your periphery vision, for instance. But when you look right at it and you see that's going to drive you nuts. You're going to be like, no, you got to straighten those gutters. Yeah. But Colin, your house is going to flood.
No, yeah, no. When the builders come back, I'm going to be like, is this No, you got to do something about this. So, also, just real quick, before we get into the topic as well, I should update everyone about the fence. Because we talked about the fence. So I ended up getting my money back.
Okay.
Because I sent a missive to them. Because I can't even, it's like almost unbelievable, the whole fence story. They put the fence in the wrong place. I actually pay them a nominal fee to come and move it because I just want to grease the wheels to catch everyone up.
Sure.
Which everyone's like, what are you doing? So then, which is totally reasonable. I'm just so averse to fucking conflict. So then they come over. The people have no idea what they're supposed to do. And then they leave my yard like a mess as well afterwards. So then I sent Dagan, I forwarded him the message. I sent them this email and just really ripped into them.
Oh, it's hilarious. This
Then
email is a work
them,
of genius.
Thank you.
It really is.
And so they did email me back saying something like, this was a difficult email to read or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And because part of the email was like, I'm not paying you the rest of the money I owe you. There's no chance that I'm paying you the rest of the money. No, like I literally put in parentheses, 0% chance that I'm paying you the money.
Just to clarify.
And then they actually refunded me the rest of the money that I'd paid. Because I was like, you really should do the right thing and give me my money back.
Wow. Okay. That is at least the right thing.
So
but I don't know
what the fuck I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm learning out here.
It's always hard. You got to kind of custom tailor your approach to whoever you're dealing with when it comes to contractors. But the lack of competency has gone unanswered. Like that's going to be something in perpetuity that just continues apparently.
I guess so.
I guess.
I warded one of my neighbors off though. I was like, never use these people. And I don't say who they are publicly because I don't, I'm not trying to do that.
Sure.
I have a disproportionate platform. I don't know that's.
Yeah,
that's what I mean. So
yeah, but you could do that, and you would think from a entrepreneur, from a company standpoint, they would fear that.
Yeah, but they don't.
But they don't.
All right, Dave. Today's episode of KnockBack, our retro and nostalgia podcast, is going to be a really nice and brisk one for us because Dagan's. So he took this new job. He's kind of easing into it. He's taking a little bit of time off. So we're going to do a nice little, because he's taking next week off. Actually, I'm going to be recording with someone else, which I've never done before. Yeah. Dagan's just taking a week off. Dagan's been on every episode of the show. I think this is the first one. Mom. I did one with Mom.
Yeah.
So I think you've been on almost every episode. I've missed, I think, one or two. And then, so anyway, I felt like we should just do a nice, easy topic. And Dagan came up with the idea, which was 10 moments, like 10, how would you say, like 10 things from the 90s, 10 moments or trends or whatever encapsulated in the 90s, what makes the 90s great.
Yeah, exactly.
How would you kind of word it?
Yeah, I put top 10 favorite things from or about the 90s, that specific decade. So we get anywhere from 1990 through 99.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I selected 5 and you selected 10 actually.
Yes, we just talked about
this. So you have enough to really pick and choose.
Yes.
And
exactly.
I'll leave it to you to begin. I'm curious how you want to start. What I don't know, topic you want to bring up to begin talking about the 90s.
Well, you know what, Kyle? Thank you for that. I'm excited because I love doing topics centered in the 90s. And here's the reason why. I think these episodes could be even more accessible to like a wider audience, a wider listenership, more watchers. It's a little more inclusive, perhaps, because, our younger listeners and watchers now will have a chance at actually having their own memories of these things that we're talking about today, as compared to, say, the topics that we do from the 70s or the 80s. Not that we don't love those decades too. Of course we do. It's a huge part
Rosemary's
of the show.
Baby is not accessible to young people today.
Well, that's exactly it. Right. Our younger listeners, not everybody's an old crusty Gen Xer like me, or even, there's even younger listeners than you, going back 10 years and now going back another decade. So sure. I think, in other words, going back only 30 years is a little more inclusive, maybe a little more enjoyable for a larger sized and nice sized group. Definitely. And, almost saying like, welcome, you remember these things too this time. We're not talking about the crustier days. We're talking about a little bit more contemporary times. And, that's where I'll set it. The other thing I should say about what I chose, now Colin and I were texting right before the show, And we notoriously don't like to have a lot of communication before the show. We like to kind of surprise each other, leave it up to conversation, let it be spur of the moment. I think that's smart podcasting. You know, we pay attention to dudes like Joe Rogan and Ira Glass and all those guys that are like, they made conversation an art form, you know? And I think that sort of sporadic, more spur of the moment conversation is really I think that's what makes it special. You know, we have that brotherly thing going on. So keep things fresh.
And I'll note real quick, I did do Rogan twice, and he walks into the room and just starts recording. So pretty much just sits down and starts. I met him for 30 seconds before we started recording the first time.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So sure of himself, really comfortable in his own skin, knows what he's good at.
It's very cool.
And, you know, so it's like, and, you know, I wanted to say too, Kyle, and I wrote this down here as a note to myself to remember, just about a note about my selections. I tried to steer it. Now, the 90s, huge decade, a lot of great things, a lot of great pop culture things, memories, nerd culture stuff. But what I tried to do was I tried to be purposeful in this and try to pick things that were maybe a little more beneath the surface, maybe a little more underrated or under-acknowledged. In some cases it'll be a little more mainstream depending on what I choose to talk about, because I do have a host of options to choose from.
The world is your oyster.
But this way, I'm not repeating myself too much, you know, thinking about back to past episodes of stuff that we have talked about at length. And also, just in the spirit of keeping things fresh for you guys, hopefully we'll get to talk about stuff that, you know, not only have I not gotten a chance to talk about yet, but also stuff that's probably going to be topics eventually included in this, so they could kind of serve as a little appetizer for things that, you know, we're going to talk about much, you know, and much broader, and much more granularly than just covering it in broad strokes today as a 90s memory. So, you know, that's where all started. So, you know, it was my brainchild, and you were agreeable to it, Kyle. So I want to give you the option to go first if you'd like to kick it off.
I'm happy to let you lead off. I'll just say, for mine, it's fun. We always take different tacks, which I kind of like. For me, it was more like I tapped into what I thought were 5 undercurrents of the 90s that kind of built on things of the past and kind of came to fruition either at that time or a little later. So
I like that.
I'll explain what that means when we get there. It'll make more sense.
Okay.
So it's not like, you know, I really love Stone Temple Pilots. I'm not going to say, nothing. I do love Stone Temple Pilots, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to say that. It'll be a little more meta, and you guys will see what I mean. So
cool.
But I want to see what you do first, so I'll leave it to you.
That sounds very thoughtful. Okay, so let me paint a picture for you guys a little bit. Let me set the stage for you guys here for Dagan in the 1990s. This is the decade where I would complete my last few years of high school, right? My junior and senior year of high school. I would graduate. I would go off to college in far off Philadelphia. I would graduate from sort of film / animation / art school in 98. Now, along the way, I met the girl who would become my wife. I think Helene and I met in 96. So we dated for, 6 years before we got married. So that's right. So that happened. And then here's my other interesting thought that I wanted to set the stage for the 90s, Colin. This is something that is interesting to me, and I think you probably feel the same way, is that it's the last period of time that we would know before the world really changed in September of 2001. That those of us who are old enough will remember that, right? I really don't mean that to sound heavy, actually, but that's such a clear line of demarcation for me when it comes to memory, when it comes to nostalgia. You know, it's almost like that BC AD thing for us, for our generation, for our generations. And I always seem to associate my memories and my nostalgia and media, pop culture, nerd culture. You know, we talk about games, talk about books, TV, film, toys, with a sort of pre 9/11 or post 9/11 label sort of in the back of my head all the time. And I think that's what makes the 90s particularly interesting. It's a collection of years that are pre 9/11, of course, but they're so close. They're so near to the line. And I think that gives it its own sort of distinctive flavor in retrospect.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it's very well said, because it's so funny. We talked about it on the show, but I see I'm obsessed with time. I think that's obvious to people. And I think you are in a way too.
Definitely.
This is certainly played out in my pursuit of history and dates. And I see things in a sort of timeline in my head. I really do. When I think about it, I'm like, you know, Empire Strikes Back. My brain goes to like, all right, early 80s, 1980. What happened in 1980? But, you know, and it kind of delves in. That's how I was talking to Micah about this recently, where I was like, I have a really uncanny knack of being able to tell you around when almost anything happened in the last like 150 years at least. You know, like where if you're like, when did this movie come out? I'd be like, it probably came out between like 1930 and 1940. I can give you that, or, you know, like something like that. Or if you look at a picture and you're like, this is clearly from the mid 1950s. Like, so we have a real obsession with that time. And I also use 9/11 as that demarcation because I was in 12th grade. I had just broken my collarbone right before then. So I had just stopped playing hockey. That was right when I stopped playing hockey. And I have a real fascination, not only with the 90s, but specifically 1998, 9, 2000, 2001, because I feel like there's this weird lead up, like the summer of 2001. I remember so vividly, like the months, the days, the hours before 9/11. And you think about it, and it really has nothing to do with anything because it was more meaningful for us as our father is a New York City firefighter, but also, it's just like the United States changed at that point. Our foreign policy changed. We became, I think, much more staunchly conservative for a while and all of that. So, yeah, there was a lot of, I totally feel that. It's very well described because I also play with time in that fashion as well.
You're drawn to the notion of that. And I think, I think that the FDNY thing with Dad and being in New York at the time, and I was working in the city, so certainly the way mass transit was affected, you know, the buses and the trains and everything. It was I always draw up those memories with the memories of the other things around that time, you know, whether it's Napster or video games or a DVD that I was watching or, you know, PlayStation 2 or whatever I'm thinking about at that point, you know?
Sure.
So yeah, I definitely wanted to say that it's a very special era and I'm excited to talk about it with you. So I'm starting with kind of a cheaty one. I'll go for my first one. Yeah. And that's something that I think because I'm so sort of amused by this notion. And maybe I've talked about it on the show a little bit before, but never to this degree. And that's, you know, I call this my compare and contrast between the 80s and the 90s. And basically what it is the idea that the 90s as an entire decade, but particularly the early 90s, which are going to be, I have a lot of things in the early 90s that I'll talk about. Probably the lion's share of what I'll talk about today is early-ish 90s. Is the 90s as a direct reaction to the 1980s. And what I mean by that is the 90s in terms of fashion, in terms of music, in terms of film, TV, trends, all that kind of stuff, fads. It was a new decade coming in, and it was such a dramatic shift away from everything that came in the 10 years before. And it always really kind of cracked me up because I remember noticing this even as a kid, as say, you know, it really made me laugh. Even as a young person, like let's say 91, 92, I'm 17, 18 years old. I'm still in high school. And I remember noticing it and being pretty, you know, thinking it's a pretty hysterical notion to say, like, it really seemed like, and still seems like to me, that the 90s was actually embarrassed of the 80s. And that it made sure to take off in the complete opposite direction as a result of that. And what I mean is, like, take it in, if you're old enough to know the 80s, or at least know what happened in the 80s, whether you were there or not, because I think the 80s is such a flashy period. I think everybody knows about it. You know, it's bright neon colors, you know, and that changed over in the 90s to earth colors, you know, very muted palettes. So we had that loud and that wild and the busyness. All of that became understated and all of that became toned down. So you had in the 80s where everything was mismatched and layered and boisterous and garish and overdone. And it was like a little bit of like go big or go home, you know. That all became a flannel and jeans, you know. That all became like a simple puka shell necklace to replace like the arm of Swatch watches, you know, pastel Swatch watches going up. And, you know, no more high hair, bless its soul, right? Everything was seemingly designed to blend in the 90s rather than to stand out, particularly coming into 90, 91, 92, 93. It was such a exaggerated notion it was such opposite of the 80s. And, like we think like and this is really broad strokes covering the whole thing. And I only say it this way because it really just does really crack me up. I think back to like hair metal and glam rock and everything that was on MTV, for instance, like coming in 85, 86 and beyond, all the way to the turn, where it turned into the 90s. And that just became grunge. So you had like the makeup and the lace and the frill and the crazy guitars with like the 3 whammy bars, just became like literally like a dude with a striped shirt, jeans, and a regular guitar. It was such a night and day shift to, almost seem like, and I wonder what the 90s would have been, especially the first half of the 90s, had the 80s not been so overdone and been so exaggerated and been so crazy and wacky and all that kind of stuff. It was really as if the 90s was saying, let's just forget about what happened back there, all right? But it was just also obvious. The transition between decades seemed like not even a transition. It felt like it was really kind of abrupt and drastic. I think with the exception of 89, there was probably the phantoms were starting to seep in of how it would turn. But besides that, I think it just really, I love the way the 90s just really flew in the face of the 1980s without mercy. It was just like the early 1990s seemed to be trying to brainwash us into forgetting the jelly bracelets and the neon colors and, the 3 pairs of socks with the jeans tucked in and Boy George and all this stuff, all this crazy
never
stuff.
Never forget Boy George. Never.
That seems so. All that stuff seemed so normal in the 80s, and then the 90s was like, let's just go the other way. Let's just say that never happened, and prefer,
do you think,
prefer we just forget about it.
I was going to ask you real quick though.
Yeah,
I've thought about this before, and I don't know that I've ever even put words to it, but. And this wasn't true, I don't think, for a while, and I think it's just based on human laziness. But do you think that we categorize kind of lazily like the 90s, the 80s, the 70s as being like these really it's like this monotype of like the 70s, like as if nothing in the 70s was important in the 60s or the 80s and so on and so forth. I've often wondered if like market changes happen at the turns of decades as a reaction to things that happened in the past, or so that things are neatly organized naturally, or if we're so lazy as people that we like can't imagine the 80s bleeding into the 90s or the 90s bleeding into the aughts. And I've always wondered that, like, I don't, when you think about the 50s, you don't think about Leave It to Beaver in like the 60s, or even a better example is like when you think about the Brady Bunch goes into the 70s, but in my mind, I don't really think about them as a 70s show. I think about it as a 60s show.
Okay. That's interesting.
The Cosby Show is another example. Like I think about that as an 80s show, even though it bleeds into the 90s. And I don't know. I often, the way you describe it is interesting because I kind of look at things the same way. And yet I wonder if it's really that clean or not. The Gilded Age or whatever, like I don't, we think about the 20s and the 30s and the wartime 40s and all. I don't know. It just seems like an interesting sort of organizational tool. Point.
I mean, it's realistic to know that it is more nuanced than our memories allow us to remember. And it's interesting because I was having this conversation with Helene last night, and it was like, I was describing this to her and I was saying the 80s into the 90s was such a funny decade because I've seen shifts from other, I'm old enough to know a few of these. And I'm thinking back to like one that I wasn't there for, but like, it doesn't seem like the 50s into the 60s was as dramatic. It seemed much more it seemed much more gradual. The 50s into the 60s, where it was like by the end of the 60s, things were, free love and the hippie movement and anti-war and all that kind of stuff that was going on is so different than the 50s. But you had, 6, 7, 8 years in between that period where like that change, that evolution,
like Greenwich Village and the Beatniks and all,
exactly. It was much more gradual where it's like, no, if you think about the 70s, it wasn't all wood paneling and hospital green and orange and, it wasn't like that. It was more nuanced. I think what helps with this, Kyle, at least for me, is to have as many sort of touchstones as you can from each year in a decade. So remember everything you can from 91, 92, list them off. And then you could see how those things change, at least insofar as trends and media and pop culture and all that kind of stuff. you could see how that one year came into another rather than thinking about a broad 10-year period. And then you could kind of see it becomes more nuanced. Then you could see, okay, like 80 whatever Seinfeld came in, but before that it was really family sitcoms, and really before that the only really dramatic sitcom was Archie, and all this kind of stuff, Archie Bunker and all this other kind of stuff. So you could think about how things changed over time. It's easier to break it down year by year. And even if you get more granular than that and you just go by every 6 months or something, which is kind of what I tried to do in the 90s, only because I was trying to single out one video game, one TV show. If I could pick a movie, which one would it be? And a lot, again, like I said, like I tried not to pick something that we already talked about already, which which influenced my decisions. But for the most part, if you think about it in those terms, it becomes much more, I think it becomes much more easy to remember, to actually remember, rather than your mind just tricking you into those cliches, those cliched memories of a decade or a time, or a year. Yeah,
very well said. I like that one. So for me, I told you that I want to pick on things that I think are in the same spirit kind of what you're approaching, which is how things evolved and became bigger or more notable in the 90s, or how we use things in the past that we also still use today. And the big thing that I wanted to start with was just the internet. I feel like it can't be understated how much the internet has changed. And it was funny. I was reading some of the comments on our movie theater podcast, the one we did about the movie theater, which people really liked.
Oh, good.
And multiple people wrote in saying that they really thought the collect call stories we told were funny, specifically about how there was the thing where you would call someone and then you would like say your name, but you tried to get in a message in that thing. And it was like, people can go listen to it. It was like, so I think people will dig this stuff too. And we got to go into it on our early internet podcast, but in a more succinct way here, which is very early into KnockBack's run, by the way, but in a very succinct way here, I felt like I got onto the internet for the first time in like 1994, 1995. We had it in the house in 1996. And originally I was going to say like, well, the personal computer, the rise of the personal computer, but I actually don't think the 90s are the rise of the personal computer. That's the 80s. For me, that's when people started getting computers in their houses, and some people started connecting to like Usenet and whatever, but the World Wide Web is a product of the early 90s, and that's how we interacted with the internet. We don't primarily interact with the World Wide Web at all. In fact, you can use the internet today and not interact with it really at all in terms of like going to websites and stuff like that. That's right. One avenue of interacting with the internet. But back in the day, that was pretty much the only avenue we had. And the one memory that I really had here that I wrote down was that we had to earn it. We had to earn everything on the early internet. You had to like know where to look. You had to have the patience to find things, and the resources were really limited. And I don't think we really quite understood at the time what was happening. It happened so quickly. I remember that it went from almost not only not caring about having a computer in your house, but it was just like a foreign thing to many people, to by the end of the decade, it was becoming weird not to have a computer.
Yes.
And not to have it connected to the AOL or CompuServe or high-speed internet. And I wrote down that it was really in 2000, I remember, when my friends started getting high speed. So we were really living in the dial-up internet era, and it was so quaint. And I think younger people will really enjoy knowing how quaint it was, just from AOL Instant Messenger and emailing people and like having to hit send and refresh to it wouldn't ping automatically that there were new emails unless you like looked for them. Remember that? Remember when you would send your emails to an outbox and then you'd hit send and then it would send all your emails and look for new ones and stuff like that? It was a AOL keywords and going to different forums and building your own website on GeoCities or Tripod or AngelFire, and these various websites was a huge thing. The search engines we used were totally different. If you went back 25 years and you're like, what will be the dominant 2021 search engine? People would be like, of course it's going to be Yahoo or Excite or Alta Vista or Ask Jeeves or like whatever weird kind of, Hotbot and all of these different things. It was just so different. And it's really interesting because we didn't quite have it yet about what this thing would become. But the 90s, when you look back on it, it's like, yeah, it was happening really rapidly. And
oh my God,
the internet was kind of almost fed to us slowly because it had to be by virtue of 28.8 or 56K modems or whatever you had and phone lines. But it was a way for us to kind of absorb in the 90s what would ultimately happen, which is the complete takeover of the internet and it being a ubiquitous part of our lives, the connectivity of it. And so I feel like that's a big part of the 90s, is this lead in from personal computers and what a computer can do for you and what computers can do for business or the stock market or really obscure forms of interconnectivity. People were like, oh, maybe we can just fax things and all of that. It's like by the end of the decade, the dot-com bubble was growing and real companies were starting to be founded that still exist today. Many don't, but Google was founded in this era and others. And it's remarkable to me to think back on those days. And I'm sad for people because they missed it. If there's every generation has this stuff that's endemic to their generation, but there was a very small period where the internet was this very unique thing. People were scared of it. People were scared of meeting people online. It's so funny when you think about it. Like we put our whole lives online today, but I remember when I had friends online and my mom and dad were like, what are you talking? Everyone was like, they thought they were going to murder me or rape me or something horrible. And it was just so, people were using ICQ and IRC to talk to each other. It was a totally unique and interesting time. And it just happened for a little while. And because when you see things like Facebook was founded in 2003, 2004, and Twitter was founded in 2007 or whatever, YouTube and all these things, they're going to stay. They're not going anywhere. But back in the day, the things that we were using and mixing up with, they're gone, most of them.
Yeah.
And
that's true.
That's why I'm so fascinated by like even my old game fax documents from the 90s and 2000s and why I've not edited them, even though I write better now today, because I'm like, these are pieces of like almost digital archaeology.
Oh, yeah.
This was a document I uploaded to GameFAQs when I was in 10th grade. It's exactly the way it was. And every typo and every weird thing I say and it's all from Colin when he was 14, and it's untouched. And that's pretty neat because a lot of things can't be interacted with in that way anymore. AOL, for instance, the way we used it is gone. Dial-up internet is like, I think only people in really far away places use, and usually they use satellite internet now. And I don't know. We used to download like really postage sized videos of things because we could, and it used to take days to download them. Yeah. And it's amazing. I remember downloading like episode 1's trailer and it took days.
Can you imagine?
To download it. And it was a horrible quality, It was literally like, 260 by whatever, 180 or, whatever.
No, seriously.
So what do you think of that? What do you think of that?
You're absolutely right. And it is really because of how rapidly everything evolved. It leaves us with those brief periods of time before those changes were implemented or as they were implemented, but it happened so quickly. I remember my first experience with the internet. Probably one of my first experiences was my college had an internet lab in the basement. It was like the sub-basement because the basement of my building, the Art Institute at that time was in the Art Deco building on Chestnut Street in Philly. And it's a gorgeous building. It was 9 stories, but then the library was in the basement. And then the sub-basement was this internet lab, which I initially thought that was like the suite of 3D Studio Max and Maya computers for the 3D animators, for the CG guys, but it wasn't. It was an internet lab. And I remember going down there one day. I don't even know what I was doing down there. And I was like, I had a very obscure at that time, very surface idea of what the internet was, but I really had no experience with it. And I remember being really confused by it. And it was packed with people and they were probably just doing their instant messenger thing or in chat rooms at the time or whatever they were doing. Yeah. And I remember being really befuddled by it. I was like, I don't know what this is. But also at the same time, getting a sense of like, I'm going to need to know about this stuff soon. Like it's catching up and, like you're going to have to get up to speed with it soon, but being really confused by it at the time. And that was probably in 94, 95. By the time I graduated in the summer of 98, it was unheard of not to have an email address, for instance, as I was applying for jobs. So that's how quickly it changed, where it was like, I didn't even have my own personal computer yet, but I had an email address and used my friend Brian's computer to correspond with prospective employers because, that was, you couldn't do it without an email address. And that was already the middle of 98. So that's how in that 3 years, that's how drastically it changed, where I didn't even know what the internet was to like already like this is an essential part, a couple of years before 2000, like it was already an essential part of my job search. And, that would only intensify as every day went forward from then, especially for me, for being in a more technologically related field, being an animator at that time, working in CD-ROMs, working for a tech, what would be construed as a tech company back then. And, that was the crazy thing, was how rapidly my understanding of it changed, and that, I remember it was a very similar feeling to, because we didn't grow up with a personal computer. Like you said, in the 80s, that was really the era of the personal computer. We didn't have a Commodore 64 or an Apple II or something like that in my house. Almost everybody else that I knew did. John did. Tommy had one. His dad was an accountant. He had one in the basement. I think he used it for work. He had those, one of those antiquated printers with the huge paper,
dot matrix,
dot matrix, the whole dot matrix bit, and playing like Karateka and California games and all that kind of stuff. But I remember being really confused by the computer then too, because we didn't have one. Even using it in school on occasion, using it at Tommy's house in his basement on occasion. I remember being really confused by it. Back then you had all the DOS prompts and having to type everything in. It just seemed very technical. It just seemed like something completely off my radar and a little advanced for me. I remember thinking the same thing about the internet, but that was something that quickly caught on and just became like a mainstay in everybody's life. I mean, not even to talk about connection, the dial-up connection. I remember that in Helene's house in the mid 90s, they had a personal computer, but it was in the family room. Her two parents and her two sisters shared it. So there was 5 of them sharing the computer. And then when I was visiting, I would jump on there and check my emails and stuff. And they had the AOL, they had the 56K dial-up connection. That was before broadband, before cable, before DSL or any of that stuff. And dude, that's how quickly it changed. By the year 2000, it was already leaps and bounds ahead of where anybody could have imagined it in 97, let alone 95. So unbelievable.
Very quick.
Unbelievable.
Definitely. All right, I got to kick it back over to you for your next.
Okay, I wanted to go here because this is a really important one for me.
Yeah.
And Colin, of course, will remember this. Now, I'm going to jump around with mine a little bit just to let you guys know. I'll jump back and forth within the decade if that's okay. I did entertain the thought of taking my 10 picks, now 5 picks in sequential order as per the year, but I didn't like how that shook out in terms of variety from topic to topic. So sure. I'm going to take you guys on a little bit of a wild ride to and fro. Keep you guys on your toes out there.
Please.
So that being said, let me begin though in 91 this time with MTV's Liquid Television. Now, I mean, this is my heart of animation hearts. For the uninitiated, Liquid Television was a sort of animated variety show. They called it an animated showcase, but it was an anthology show which ran originally from 91, where I discovered it. I was a junior in high school. Was I senior? No, it came out the summer between my junior and senior years in high school. And I remember the weekend it debuted, I was away at art camp. I went to this 2-week art camp my sophomore and junior years, right after those years of high school in Southampton then was Southampton University out in the Hamptons on Long Island, and really great fine art school. And they had a summer art program for kids that were interested in, going on to art school basically. And it was a really cool thing where you stayed over. It was only 2 weeks and you dormed and you took art classes and, you ate at the mess hall and you met people from other school districts that were like-minded, future art students and stuff. And it was really neat. And that's the weekend we were there that Liquid Television debuted. And I was automatically like, what is this? So the show, if you guys can imagine, if you've never seen it, now you could look it up on YouTube now, but the show is made up of a dozen or so, maybe 15 or 16, it depended, short animated segments, and each one completely unrelated and independent of the pieces that came before or after. So a complete animated variety show. And it was a collection of these often stylish, most of the time very offbeat cartoons all spliced together, and it was like a 22-minute format. It was a 30-minute format, but of course there were commercial breaks on MTV at the time. So it was something that I instantly fell in love with. I mean, I remember being so smitten with this show when I was a young kid in high school, and it was just a nerd, you know, for a nerdy animation loving 17-year-old, it was a dream come true. I was already really on board for animation. I was already considering, you know, being an animator for a living. I wanted to go to art school. I was already super immersed in anime. So this came along and it was like a whole nother adventure for me, a whole nother plus. And the shorts were done on the show in a variety of styles, which also made it stand out from, you know, typical television animated fare, especially the kids stuff. So you had, if you guys could imagine, you had some hand-drawn animation in there. You had some cut paper. You had some live action and animation mixed, you know, hybrid. You had puppets. You had some early CGI stuff on there, which was really, really cool. You had cell animation and even more techniques that were really strange that hadn't been introduced to me yet, like paint on glass and sand under glass and stuff like that. And of course, stop motion you had in there too. And you know, for me, Kyle, it was like, although these were short form cartoons, this was really the cool bit too. Although these were all short form cartoons, let's say they were 30 seconds to a minute, maybe 2 minutes long each one. Many of them were episodic in nature. So it really compelled you to tune in from episode to episode because those shorts would continue in subsequent episodes of the show. So, and some of the shorts were one-offs too. So it was really kind of a neat mixture. And I'll name some of my favorites, and you guys could go and look them up online. I think you could see whole collections of Liquid Television on YouTube now. It was hard to get them for a long time. Or you could just watch the one-offs. But some of my favorites, and these may ring a bell with some of you guys when I say them. Winter Steel, the Art School Girls of Doom. I mean, that's like the best title for a show ever. The Specialists. My friend Joe, my now friend, I befriended this guy who's like my idol when I was a kid, Joe Horn. His collection of shorts called Stevie and Zoya, super cool, super stylish. He was a New York guy originally that went out west. Stick Figure Theater, which was really, I know a lot of people would remember that one. It was basically what they did with that series of shorts is they took audio snippets from classic films. Let's say an Alfred Hitchcock joint, or they did one of Night of the Living Dead, maybe Hamlet, something like that. And then they would animate it in a stick figure style and, you know, sync it with the audio, with the dialogue and everything. And it was, even though it was stick figures, it was beautifully animated, very expressive, very funny. Peter Chung's Aeon Flux. A lot of people remember Aeon Flux, of course. That was like a really bizarre, but really gorgeously illustrated and animated piece. Grinning Evil Death. This was a one-off, Grinning Evil Death. And I have to say, go on YouTube if you guys get a chance and after the show and watch Grinning Evil Death. I don't know if there's a short, although it was a one-off, maybe it's 3 or 4 minutes long, a little long for Liquid Television, but had a tremendous impact on me. It's basically about a little kid who gets a prize out of a cereal box, which turns out to be a ring that he thinks is going to transform him into a superhero. And the actual superhero comes and tries to defend the city from this giant robotic cockroach. It's just very cool. It's very campy and it has a great payoff at the end. I won't ruin it. And the other one I want to mention is because he passed last year, the illustrator Richard Sala, the late great Richard Sala. He did a series called Invisible Hands on there, which was really beautifully illustrated, very bizarre, very odd, and beautifully illustrated. But the show, for me, Kyle, and this is a word I don't really use too often when I think about things or when I refer to things, but it's so fitting in this case. The show was really just so punk. It was just really punk rock at that time. And it was a key part of the early 90s TV animation renaissance. And it really fed my desire to be an animator back then. I was always drawn to those things that were a little more offbeat. When I was young, I found like Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Heroes playing like in the morning on like Viacom, or later on it would be something like Danger Mouse. Just things that didn't quite fit the mold of the other things that we grew up with, you know, Smurfs and Popeye and Looney Tunes and the Disney stuff, the Hanna-Barbera stuff, the classic superheroes, Super Friends cartoon. Like, I loved all those things, but there was a sameness about it and there was a safeness to them. You know, they seemed like the things that were always there, you know, the old standbys. This was something different. You know, this was so, even compared to anime, It was just so different than anything I'd seen in my prior 16 years now being a 17-year-old and being like, what is this? And they're actually playing it on television. I was so drawn to the variety of the awesome and the offbeat art styles, and also the irreverent tone, which was always interesting to me because it was just safe enough for TV in terms of violence, in terms of sexual content, in terms of dialogue, the things the characters would say, the level of darkness. It was like, wow, they're really walking the line of what they could show here, especially in animation, because think about in 1991 terms, in America, animation was still, anime hadn't taken off yet. This was still, animation and cartoons were still seen as a children's medium. So you could see parents, like kids back then, flipping through the channels, maybe 6, 7 years old, and landing on a cartoon, and the parents like, what the hell is this? It's about like some homicidal flower that's like trying to kill the other flowers. It's like, we weren't used to things like this yet. So it really opened my eyes to the possibilities of animation beyond the things I grew up with. Liquid television always reminded me of almost like a Sesame Street style format, and sort of a Sesame Street styled model of a show with that sort of anthology feel and sort of a variety show where it cuts from clip to clip and nothing it's kind of quick cut, fast paced, but for much older kids, and Liquid Television, really what it did, it was it merged independent animation with the best kinds of really commercial animation, things that were innovative, things that were, that really people weren't seeing, used to seeing yet. It fused those two mentalities. It fused sort of the artistic and the commercial mentalities and sort of made it cool. So I remember like Ren and Stimpy, I would rush to get the VHS tape ready, queued up to record Liquid Television whenever I could catch it. And, back then we had, in order to see like more adult animation or more content that wouldn't necessarily fit into the parameters of television or a G-rated kids film, you had to go to film festivals. And we had this film festival back then that old crusty codgers like me will remember, called Spike and Mike's Twisted. I think it was called Spike and Mike's Twisted Festival of Animation. And that was almost like what Liquid Television was. In fact, I think Liquid Television sourced some of the shorts off of that festival circuit for the show. Not all of them. Some of them were commissioned. But, that's what it was like. It was like seeing an art house animation festival in the comfort of your own living room. And I was at the perfect age for it. I had the perfect interest level in animation for it. And, animation institutions like San Francisco's Colossal Pictures, RIP, now gone, and other entities like Wild Brain Animation, who are still around and still very successful, sprang out of Liquid Television. So very important and very influential thing, not only for pop culture and media and for MTV, and kudos to MTV for doing stuff like this too. That this was the heyday of MTV doing really cool shit. I would say the early to mid 90s was like where MTV was like, and I'll talk about one more thing probably today, referring to MTV during the same time period, but really Liquid Television was really a special, influential, one of a kind thing. And I had to give it a nod. And it makes sense that it's my first thing because it's still very, very important to me.
Yeah, it's it's your second thing, right?
Right. Besides, just that broad stroke of like the cartoony differences between the 80s and the 90s.
Right. All right. I was gonna say because did I hit my head? All right.
The answer is yes.
Well, yeah, I did because Allie dropped me on my head when I was a kid. But yeah, thanks, I remember watching this with you very clearly. And what I remember about MTV in the 90s was, especially in the early 90s, you could kind of see it shifting and becoming more of what it would become later. People really longed for old MTV. And I understand that. They did start losing their music video kind of panache, and they started it's just that I kind of am happy that happened because we ended up getting MTV2 out of it, which was a fucking awesome channel in its heyday. That's where they put all the music. And then MTV was able to explore. It's almost funny when you think about like how reality TV has dominated like the last 25 years. But it was really quite extraordinary when MTV, and it's MTV that started doing that stuff first. And, with Real World and Road Rule. So,
oh, yeah.
And now it's like you can't escape that stuff. But that was like that was the reality TV of the day. So I love that you brought up MTV because I think it's really important. And I almost think underrated in the 90s. And it kind of does segue into what I was going to say next in this broad stroke kind of sense, which is I love the way we interacted with television changed in the 90s and what we expected out of it. And it's funny because this sounds so ridiculous, but we used to watch television. We used to actually sit there and watch it. And I didn't really realize how I didn't do that anymore until, like I said, I think on the show a few times in the past when I lived with Mom for a while, when I moved out to Virginia and was waiting to buy my house. And I realized she and her husband, Larry, they watch TV. They sit down and watch television. And I couldn't do it. Like I couldn't stand it for more than 20 minutes at a time. I'm like, I can't believe you sit here. So a good example is Mom, loves Dr. Pimple Popper, which I think is on A&E or something like that. Yeah. It's a great show. I love it. But I was trying to explain to her, I'm like, Mom, this show started as a YouTube show. There are dozens of hours of this without all of the trappings and commercials on YouTube for you to watch. They grabbed her from there and put them on here. I was trying to tell her, I'm like, Mom, you don't have to sit here and watch 4 minutes of commercials to get 10 minutes of Dr. Pimple Popper. I can put it on YouTube for you right now. And so I had to identify that as like something that I thought was interesting, was the way we interacted, because we were talking about the internet and the way we interacted with computers. Well, the way we interacted with television was really different too. And it's so funny you brought up the VHSs and taping things, and almost the currency of VHS, where you didn't necessarily have enough tapes and you had to start taping over things and all of that. But also, it's funny, by the late 90s, we started getting rumblings, and I believe I even knew someone that went with early DVR, and how far things changed. And I also have to say, like, even though the preview channel and stuff like that existed in the 80s, another thing that I think people that thought the collect call story was funny will remember, and you'll remember this for sure, is that we used to have a channel that we would watch to tell us what was on the other channels.
Yes.
And you had to wait. It would be the slowly scrolling. And it would be like channel 2, channel 3, and it would go all the way down. And then for the next 90 minutes, it would tell you what was on. So very similar to the channel select that you have today on cable. But you had to, instead of calling that up on demand, you didn't know. You had to either go to this channel or just know what was on, or kind of see what was going on out there kind of willy-nilly.
Right. And
it's funny, like, it's still built into me, and I don't know if you're the same, where I won't start watching TV if I randomly put on like the news or something and it's like 9:05. I'm like, oh, I missed it. I'm not even going to bother, because I have this mentality where I'm like, oh, it started at 9. I'll just catch it another time because I missed the beginning of it. And that comes from that era, like, or the preview channel, when you would just miss what you were waiting for. And so you had to wait like 10 minutes for it to cycle all the way back to the channel you wanted. And it's so weird. I even remember, and I don't know if you remember this, like TV wasn't even watermarked. When we would watch sports in the early to mid 90s, you had no idea what the score was until it would go to commercial. And then it would come back and tell you what the score was. And then, so you could watch a baseball game or a football game or something for 20 minutes and have no idea what the score is.
Yes.
You know, unless they randomly said it or something like that. And if you went to a channel and you weren't familiar with it, there were no watermarks in the corner. So like you had no idea what channel you were even watching, and there was no thing that would bring it up and tell you what channel you were watching, and you had no idea what show you were watching. It's kind of interesting to think about. That wasn't that long ago. No. And TV is very well organized now. I have cable, obviously, and I don't really use it, but you know, you use the cable box and you can record things in perpetuity, but that's a product of the 21st century, really. In the 90s, we were still taping things and still having to catch them live or catch repeats. And I'm so glad you brought up like the late night stuff and all of that, because it's actually a show from the 80s, and I'm sure you remember it. It went on until the 2000s, but 120 Minutes on MTV was a really huge show for me, because that was where all the cool music videos were that you actually wanted to see, and it would introduce you to new music. But you had to wait until like 2 a.m. to see it. Yes. Even when it was on regular MTV, and then and Headbangers Ball and all that all started in the 80s too. So there were like these these television events, and I feel like they don't exist anymore, because even when it's like, oh, you know, This Is Us is on NBC or whatever, I'm like, who gives a shit? I mean, like, it's like, I don't care, you know, not because the show's bad, but because like, I don't need to watch it right now. And that was just totally different back in the day. I remember rushing out of hockey practices when I was in middle school, just so I would catch Seinfeld and not miss it, you know, because if you missed it, you missed it. So what do you think of that recollection of the way we interact with TV?
I mean, there's just so much to talk about there. It's crazy. I mean, I could see the proof in the pudding now with today's generation with my kids. Like, it's like torture for my kids to have to watch whatever's on television, even including on demand. Like if they're only, you know, like with Graydon, for instance, he's 10. So there's not a lot. He's not going to put on HBO. So if he's, you know, beholden to only Disney and Disney XD and Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and Nicktoons, not only the channels, but also like those are the only things he's really interested in. But also like if that includes whatever they have on demand, not just what's on airing at the moment, it's torture to him. If he can't have Netflix, if he can't have Disney Plus, and he can't have now, it's like YouTube. I was telling you before, like he's like addicted to, you know, like most kids his age, he's like getting addicted to YouTube. It's like a whole nother, it's really a game changer where kids just they're not really interested in cable TV anymore. So I could think back to like the 80s. Now, you were really young, so you may not remember this. Now, the advent of getting our first VCR, you know, which was a momentous thing unto itself. But
it was the one that
VCR,
you pressed down, right? You put the tape
top
in
loader.
Yeah.
You know, all of them were top loaders at that point, unless they were super advanced, like 4-head VCRs that were very expensive at the time, like over $1,000. So if you had a typical VCR that cost a couple $100s, it was the top loader. Now, our first one, I wish I remembered the brand. It might have been a JVC, but it had a flip panel on the front. Now, before we had cable, this was in the 80s. This was definitely before 87 because we moved to the larger house in 87. We had this VCR. I remember Mom and Dad had the TV up on this little TV cabinet that Dad had built, and underneath on the bottom shelf was the VCR. Now, this VCR had a little flip panel with dip switches in it. Now, the tech guys and girls out there will know exactly how this works. I don't know exactly. I'm not really technically savvy, but I'll try to explain it the best I can. I think basically what you did was you put the television on a particular channel, which brought the TV to like a component output for the VCR to play the whatever, you know, VHS you wanted to play. When that was on, these little dip switches had channels on them, and you could dial in cable networks. So using this thing, we would get MTV for free. We would get Nickelodeon for free. We could get, like, at that point, USA, because I like to watch Cartoon Express, right? All those early TNT maybe was one of them. So you could actually set these little dip switches and get free cable on this thing. Now, exactly, you guys, there'll be people that are watching that know how this works. I don't know exactly how it worked. Now, when we moved, we actually had, you know, Mom and Dad actually sprung for cable, so we could actually watch Nickelodeon legally and stuff like that.
Right.
But back then, I remember doing that, you know, and you had to use the VCR for it, which was really crazy. I wonder about with Mom if it's a generational thing, and also I'm not sure. You may know if her TV is a smart TV, so she could just go right onto YouTube.
Oh, no, it is. And they watch Netflix and all of that on there. That's what I was trying to say. I'm like, why are you watching
just do this
Dr. Pimple Popper when you can go on YouTube and just skip the commercials? I was almost like, I can't be around this because this is too much. I'm seeing the same goddamn commercials over and over again. It's so antiquated. I mean, it's whatever you're comfortable with, but yeah. I remember that VCR because it is a JVC. It had like the red, blue and green logo like thing on it, and like that really cool texture. I love that. Feels like a record.
God, that thing was so crazy.
So yeah, I just wanted to throw out a shout out to just kind of the way TV evolved, and I'm going to continue to talk about the way things evolved over the decade, but that was another one that I thought was so markedly different. Not just the content that was on TV and how that evolved, but just the way we interacted with it, just the way our expectations of it, and just all the rest. I feel like the beginning of the 90s and the end of the 90s were so different in that regard.
Yeah,
so
truly.
What's your third selection, Dig? So
it was amazing to me, actually. I don't know why this surprised me, but how much music came up for me when I thought about, you know, some of my favorite things, bands, albums. 120 Minutes was certainly one of my things. Maybe I'll get a chance to talk about it. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to choose that one, but that was a big one for me too, especially with the advent of becoming an alternative music fan. But for me, I wanted to say one that's really important and just left such an imprint on me. I have such vivid memories of this rap group in my car on cassette, I dated a girl for many years that lived about 45 minutes away. So like I had these guys on repeat day in and day out in my life for years. And that's the Wu-Tang Clan. And specifically their 1993 debut album, Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. When I think of the 90s and I think of music, there's so many bands, there's so many albums, tracks, memories associated with those songs, but this really had to be the one for me, and this really had to be the album for me too, because if I think back to where it started with rap, for me personally, Kyle, and we laughed about Bill Cosby rap and the way PJ said it and everything like that, but I had really been a big fan of rap and hip-hop music up to that point already, dating back to about 1987 or so. And it definitely started with me. We grew up in New York. We had access to Hot 97. We had access to 98.7. We had access to DJ Red Alert and all the big, the big hip hop culture in New York that was just on the radio, just on the airwaves. So if I'm being truthful, my earliest recollections of hearing rap music was probably driving with Aunt Joni in her car and her listening to those stations on the radio that were formerly disco stations, and Motown stations, was why she probably had them on, but they switched at certain times of the day. So she would have it on and rap music, very early rap music would be playing. I'm talking about mid 80s stuff. But for me as a fan, it probably started back with Public Enemy, and then rolling into 87, I discovered De La Soul, of course, my beloved De La Soul. And not too soon thereafter, actually very soon thereafter, Tribe Called Quest, then the whole Native Tongue thing, the whole Native Tongue team, again, out of New York with groups like Black Sheep and Leaders of the New School and Jungle Brothers. So then, rap was very big growing up where we grew up. Very racially mixed area. And it wasn't just the black kids. First of all, the black kids hung out with the white kids where we grew up. We've explained that on the show before. Like it was really a melting pot where we grew up on, our specific part of Long Island just really was, a Center Island type of thing. So it wasn't just the black kids that listened to hip hop. It was the white kids too. And so it was around everywhere. It was just around our suburbs. So I remember hearing like all the hot things on the radio at that time, just hanging out with the slightly bigger kids. So like Rob Bass and things like that. But for me, I remember even in the late 80s, we already had things like Dr. Dre and Eazy-E with NWA and the DOC and gangster rap. And pretty soon we would have Snoop Dogg and all of that thing. I think around that time in the early 90s, the NorCal stuff was already seeping in, like the Hieroglyphics crew with stuff like Dell and Casual. And we got a lot of exposure through skate videos at that time too. So we were kind of privy to a lot of hip hop. If you were a fan, you could, this is what was feeding it for us, for guys like me and PJ and everything like that. But then I remember it so well. Here comes this rap group out of New York, Staten Island and Brooklyn specifically, with such a distinctive sound and made up of all these different members, just like a lot of dudes. It wasn't like 3 or 4 people. It was like a big group of guys. And besides sounding so good and so distinctive musically and giving us at least a few of the best lyricists, I would still argue, in hip hop today, they of course started the whole motif of using and sampling martial arts films in their music. And their whole thing was kung fu films and building their whole image around presenting themselves as this elite clan of like badass kung fu warriors and like Shaolin monks, like the Shaolin monks of rap. And although the tracks were, it was typically hip hoppy in a lot of ways. The tracks were aggressive and they had that boasting and that machismo typical of rap music, dating all the way back to the inception of rap music. I mean, that's what rap music was, right? It was like, I'm the best and you're a chump. Your team is weak. That whole thing. It was really no different in terms of that sort of braggadocious and all that sort of thing. But they also had this nerdy quality to them that at least for me, and in a good way, where it was like rapping about Spider-Man and Shinobi and playing chess and the 5 Deadly Venoms and Shaw Brothers Kung Fu movies. And it was like, and Godzilla. And it was like, wait a second, like what is this? For me, it made it kind of so much more relatable and accessible in a way, because it wasn't like just fun hip hop like I would think of Tribe Called Quest, or hip hop that was really inclusive regardless of race like De La Soul. It was something like a little more traditional rap music, but also had that fun and unique quality of De La or Tribe, but in a different way. Very, very unique. And of course, it started for us with this album. Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. And then it pressed on into the 90s with a classic double CD, Wu-Tang Forever, which I would still probably argue is one of the great rap albums of all time. And I think that one came in 95, if I'm not mistaken. But the other thing that I remember about Wu-Tang specifically was having those like nerdy conversations. And we talk about this on the show sometimes with our friends, insofar as like picking your favorite and who's the best member, like we all did with like the Ninja Turtles. You know, we all had like a favorite. And in fact, better yet, with the Wu-Tang, because there were so many members, there was upwards of 9 members, 10 members, 11 members, depending on the time period, depending on the era. You know, it was more like the X-Men. You know, it was like having those 80s conversations. I remember like, oh no, Wolverine could kick the shit out of Colossus, or, you know, no, Storm is like way more powerful than Gambit. That was the whole thing, was like, no, it's all about Genius, and it's all about Inspector Deck. No, it's about RZA or Ghostface or whatever.
Or You God.
Or You God.
I always just said You God because I never heard anyone ever say You God.
And he's a member. He's still a member.
I like You God. Yeah. I just never hear anyone give him a shout out.
Here's a surprising thing. Who was it? Capadonna actually wasn't a full-fledged member of Wu-Tang until 2007, which is weird. I thought he was always, and then, you know, of course we lost Old Dirty Bastard in 2004, was it, or something? But that was the thing. It was like this battle for supremacy. You know, that was usually a thing typical of hip hop dating all the way back to the 70s. But usually that argument would sound like something like, oh, LL Cool J is like so much better than Big Daddy Kane. It was never talking about dudes in the same outfit. You know, it was never talking about, oh, like but these, you know, like that's what we did. And that was only those conversations were only amplified by each one's many solo albums. You know, each one had really successful solo efforts. Some of the classic, I mean, Raekwon, Ghostface, RZA, Genius, Inspector Deck, some of those albums are like classics, you know, in the hallowed halls of hip hop, not just insofar as Wu-Tang. So super talented. You know, I think Inspector Deck is one of the like great writers and lyricists of music, period. Genius too, I would say. And maybe Ghostface I would consider in that conversation. If you're talking about top MCs of all time, I would definitely put those dudes. I think those dudes have to be in the conversation. So it was hard for me to boil it down to just picking one group or one album from the 90s, but this was such an important one for me, dude. And I know you became a Wu-Tang fan. This was early for you. 93,
yeah, I became, so I didn't become, I mean, I knew, you know, like Cream and all that stuff, but I didn't get into Wu-Tang until you had introduced me, and I think it was 2000, to the W, which was their double album from that era.
That was 2000, yeah.
Yeah, and I really love that record. I know that that's not a Wu-Tang record that people really look back fondly on. I think a lot of it is just my, you know, I love like I Can't Go to Sleep. I still think it's like one of my favorite Wu-Tang songs.
Oh, it's a good one.
That's an awesome song.
That's a great song.
So there's a lot of good, and obviously like Gravel Pit and Protect Your Neck and all that kind of stuff are on there, but there's a lot of good deep cuts on there, and some funny ones too that you and I always used to laugh about, like Careful, you know, that song where it's like the intro is like ridiculous. I think it's ODB in the intro. So yeah, so and then I went backwards and worked from there. So yeah, it wasn't as accessible to me until that, and I think that was 2000, because I really love that record.
I remember listening to the W with you. I remember listening to you in the car. I remember you loving that. And that was actually, I consider that a good album for them. Maybe their third best, because that was a really, a period for where they were already very successful, millionaires probably many times over, and they were experimenting, and they did some cool stuff. And they were always, I mean, RZA's very instrumental in that because he's sort of the producer and he's sort of the mastermind behind everything. But, he's always very good for not resting on his laurels or their laurels. He always tries something new. He's very experimental. He's famously collaborated with Jim Jarmusch and Quentin Tarantino on scoring movies and stuff like that. He's a really talented dude. He's a visionary. And I appreciate those guys so much. When I found out, did I ever tell you about this? I was making people laugh at this with work a year or two ago, but I found out there was a thing called Woo Wednesday, where regardless of where the Wu-Tang members are in the world, if they're traveling, if they're on tour, doing their solo things, or on vacation, or in a summer home in, Aruba or wherever it is, they all get together on like a conference call on Wednesdays and catch up, and it's called Woo Wednesdays.
That's awesome. I love that. I had no idea that they did that.
Which I think RZA talked about in an interview once, and I was just always so tickled by that like on a Wednesday, if you just think about Wu-Tang on a Wednesday, they could be meeting at that moment, having that conference call, and that would be a fun one. I would love to be on one of those calls. I'm going to be honest.
I was going to say that would be a fun one to listen in on. RZA was who I was thinking about in that careful click, click. Wait, hold up, chill. What's that, son? What? It's a bad word in the next one, but he's like, got fucked. Shit. Huh? You and I used to die. We would rewind that song over and over again.
There will be people listening to that now.
Yeah. Sure. Definitely go check it out. That song is awesome.
Good stuff. It's good stuff.
The technique is ill, son. Yeah, I love that record. So many great songs. But I Can't Go to Sleep is definitely my favorite.
Oh, that's a good one, man. That's a good one.
Very historical, that one. Very deep, if you want to go check it out.
It is. All right.
Deep. The next one for me is I wanted to talk about the way that we communicate, how that changed in the 90s. And so another funny thing, and I this always comes up, although, in different places, although it can't go without saying here, is that in the 1990, let's say 1991, you would pick up your phone. You had no idea who was calling. By the end of the 90s, everyone was screening their calls, or at least a lot of people were, because of the introduction of caller ID. And so another funny thing, it's almost unimaginable, because when you pick up your phone today, you look at it and you make your decision based on who it is. And I ignore calls all the time. So back in the day, we used to have to receive those calls, and it was kind of part of a contract, because you would return calls, you would receive calls, you would answer the phone. I don't remember having anyone in my life who just ignored the phone, for instance. If you were near the phone, you had to. I love the whole social contract of it. If you're near the phone, you pick it up, you take a note. Remember how people used to get really mad if you didn't tell them someone called?
Oh my gosh!
That was another huge thing. Like, I remember, I always never did that on purpose, but I remember answering the phone for you, or especially for Dana and Allie, and forgetting, and then they'd be like, Stacy called, man, whatever, and I'd be like, I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm 8 years old or whatever, and I'm just trying to play with my G.I. Joes, and I'm answering the phone, and someone's just, some random person is looking for someone. So I love that, and I love how I have total agita about the phone today. I hate talking on the phone. I hate it. But back in the day, I had no problem talking on the phone. It's almost an interesting kind of thing. People used to just call each other to see how they were doing, but I loved the idea of, today I don't even have a house phone. I mean, that's how far it's come. But back in the 90s, that's how we communicated, obviously, and I love the whole social contract of that again. And again, something I wrote in my notes as well is, and kind of an ancillary thing. Cell phones obviously are from the 80s, and they were coming into the 90s as well. But the bigger icon for me in the 90s, Dig, is the beeper. Oh. And I just missed the beeper. I didn't really have a need for one. And then people got cell phones in high school. And so I was always fascinated by that, because even as a kid, I was like, this seems like I didn't know what the word was, but I'm like, this seems like a very egocentric kind of thing. Like, beep me and then leave me arcane digit messages that I'll then know to call you back. There were remember you would call someone and there were different ways you can communicate with them. Like 911 would be call the person back immediately or whatever. And right. So I had to throw that out there, just to kind of the way we communicated really changed over the 90s, and the expectations of communication. And obviously that ties in with the internet as well, and email and AOL, IM, and all those different things. But we were still primarily voice based at that time. And I just love the idea of I need to get in touch with someone, so I'm going to beep them. This device goes off. They get it. They look at it. They see who called them. Then they have to go find a phone, and then they have to return the call. Maybe, or maybe they don't. And so I love thinking about that. And just the idea of like, and we've talked about it when we were talking about our girlfriends and all those kinds of things, just like calling into a void. You had no idea what you were going to get. You tried to call a girl and you could get her brother or her dad or something, or you get an answering machine, or you leave the wrong message. Or I love thinking about all those different things. I feel like in some way the phone is what changed the most in that decade, because again, fast forward now, and I think it's weird that anyone has a house phone today. I mean, I know you do, and and mom does, and other people, but I'm like, I can't imagine even the need. That's another thing. When I lived with mom for those months, like the phone would ring. Yeah. You'd be like, what the hell is this? You know, like who's calling? So anyway, talk to me a little bit about what you think of that memory.
I love bringing up beepers. I forgot all about beepers. I have a lot of memories about beepers. First of all, the Sky Pager, which I guess was a brand. In the early 90s, like all the dopest city skaters in New York had Sky Pagers. Like I remember Harold Hunter, he was a pro skater for New York. He was a real character. He was like a real like emissary for New York skateboarding, and we knew him a little bit just from skating the Brooklyn Banks and stuff like that. But he was like he was like at the center of like New York skate culture in the early 90s, and he had like a Sky Pager. All the cool skaters had like Sky Pagers and stuff. And I remember not really understanding what beepers were. I knew enough to know like that's what doctors used when they needed to be alerted to come in, surgeons, stuff like that. But what I really remember, my preeminent memory of sort of beepers and Sky Pagers and stuff was in high school. I don't remember if I was a sophomore or a junior at the time, but they called an impromptu assembly, and all the grades went 9 through 12, and they announced that there would be no more beepers in school because it was a sign of the drug culture.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Huge thing. I don't remember if the principal or assistant was Mr. Chavis at the time or Mr. Holman or something, but I remember that being a very big thing. And I do remember a lot of kids in high school having them, especially the kids that were, you know, if I was a sophomore, the juniors and the seniors, especially the more thuggish types. But I also remember the volunteer firefighter types, the real nerdy volunteer firefighter types having the beepers too. With
like their calculators on their arms and their beepers.
Like their jacked up pants with their shirt tucked in, and they always drove a pickup truck, and like they were super into like fire alarms. Like it was a really weird like subculture.
They're super into fire alarms.
It's funny, dude, because I went to animation school. This was a very high school-y experience for me, but I went to animation school with one of these kids who was obviously from this area, not from Long Island like the kids we grew up with, but his thesis film, because he was an animation student, was about a kid who worked in an alarm store. And I was like, what the hell is an alarm store? Like, that's not a thing. Like, but that was his big thing. And he was like the beeper type too. So it was always, and I remember that was a very transitional period before people had cell phones. Now, the home phone thing was even a thing in my apartments and dorms through college because of how old I am. I didn't have my first, sort of flip antenna, like primitive cell phone until 2 or 3 years into my career. That was probably like 2000, maybe 2001, 2002 when I had my first cell phone. So beepers were like that thing that were, I mean, if you had money, I guess, like for 10 years before cell phones, it was pretty, it was a pretty widespread thing. It was a pretty common thing to have a pager. I just remember, and I always remember that being sort of like the hip hoppy prop, where eventually it would be like the Ferrari and the McLaren. But like back then it was like the guys were rocking the beepers because those things were expensive to have. And it wasn't the device, it was the plan.
Yeah. You had to have a service for it. Or
hundreds of dollars a month, but probably back then for that sort of thing. So it was kind of a status symbol type thing, which was really interesting. But dude, that really speaks to me. That's really funny. That's really emblematic of that era for sure.
Yeah. Just a very brief, period of time where those were relevant. So
a blip.
All right, Dave, what's number 4 for you?
All right, I think I'm going to go to this because, again, this is one I don't have the opportunity to talk about on the show. And this is also one that we probably won't do a topic about, so it'll be fun to talk about. And I also thought it would be fun to throw a comic book in here because I'm not traditionally a huge comic book guy, even though I'm a very big animation guy. But I was a really big, especially for a certain period of time, I still try to continue this trend a little bit, but I've fallen off a little bit. But I love indie comics. And there was a time when I was in art school. I started art school in 94. And, you know, I was inspired. And I was just looking for influence everywhere. Live action film, animation, television. I'd go to the video store a lot. Anime was really big for me. Video games are a huge inspiration for me, especially the things that Capcom was doing at the time and Neo Geo and stuff like that with fighting games and animation and Street Fighter Alpha. Probably starting with Street Fighter Alpha, where it was like, you know, video games were becoming like a proper animation and character design influence for me. And not to mention all Samurai Shodown and everything that came, Darkstalkers and everything that came after. But I was also going to comic book stores at the time every week. And not that I would go on Wednesday on, you know, when the new issues came out, but I would meander my way into the comic book store in Philly. There was one or two that I frequented, and just looking for anything that caught my eye, style-wise, character design-wise, just cool things. Now, definitely still not a traditional superhero fan, so I wasn't really in for like Superman and Batman and even X-Men and even some of the stuff that Image was doing at the time, which I liked Todd McFarlane. Like, I really liked his artwork. I liked his philosophies. I liked what Image did, but breaking away from Marvel and everything. But I really wasn't on board for the superhero stuff, much like you, Kyle. But the independent stuff really spoke to me. And I found a comic book that a lot of you guys will know called Bone. No dirty jokes. Oh! And I found it probably, to my best recollection, in like 95, but it was an independent comic book that started back in 1991. I hadn't been aware of it. And it was an independent comic book by a writer and illustrator named Jeff Smith, who's really a brilliant cartoonist. And the cool thing about Jeff Smith was he came out of animation. He's an older guy. You know, I think he was born in 1960, and he was an animator, a professional animator from Ohio. In fact, he had an animation studio, now defunct, called Character Builders that he co-founded with two other founding members, and they did commercial animation, and he came out of that whole tradition, and he's just a brilliant draftsman. Much different than your typical, especially at that time, comic book artist. You know, he has a real animation sensibility to his work. Very appealing, very much like Bone is, very much in the sort of in the mold of classic Disney cartoons, Donald and Mickey Mouse and all that kind of stuff. Or think about something that's really beautifully drawn, like Peyo, the way he did the Smurfs, or the French Asterix and Obelisk comics, like very, really grounded with great draftsmanship, really nice weight, but cartoony and fleshed out and really beautiful volume. But the cool thing about Bone was it was sort of had all these cartoon sensibilities, but it also was sort of merged with a Lord of the Rings styled fantasy type element to it, to the story. There were dragons and, you know, swordsmen and stuff like that. Really interesting comic book, a nice blending of cartoony and realistic art, very atmospheric, really beautifully drawn, very, very eye-catching to me. And it really centers around these three cartoon characters who are like anthropomorphic bones. They're just like, think of a dog bone that's standing up, almost like Smurf-like, but they're actually bone characters. And it's basically set around these three bone cousins, and they live in this world where they're the only ones like that. You know, there's humans and dragons and these odd creatures and a lot of, you know, again, a lot of fantasy, almost D&D styled elements to it. And I was really, again, it's almost like my cartoon sensibilities. I was always drawn to anything offbeat or unique. At the time I discovered Bone, I was reading like comic books like Rob Schraub's Scud, or anything drawn by Doug TenNapel, who's the guy who designed Earthworm Jim, or Sam Keith's The Max that he was doing for Image. Anything that was a little different. It had to be really well drawn for me, but anything that was a little sort of off the beaten path style-wise. I love sort of unique and innovative art direction. You know, I'm just really a big fan of that. And the other thing about Bone was I just found out that Netflix is finally developing an animated series for it, because Jeff Smith has been in production with an animated iteration probably 5 times through the years and ended up pulling out because he's so persnickety about the property. In fact, Nickelodeon was developing an animated feature film for years with him. And I think 4 or 5 years into development there, he was like, forget it. So he had to start back from square one. So I think later on in the year, Netflix is going to debut the animated series finally, so everybody that doesn't know Bone could get a taste of it. It started that's going to be, there's trying so hard not to, I got to own myself on that one. Son of a bitch.
You were really,
Sons of bitch.
You were going through a minefield. You did pretty good.
That was pretty good. I got pretty far. But you know, it's interesting because I feel like not a lot of people know Bone. I feel like Jeff Smith is an interesting dude, even though this comic started in 91. I think there's only 55 issues, if I'm not mistaken. So rare. It's often the book is in there's great collections. I don't know if IDW does a collection of the Bone books yet, but there are various collections through the years. I don't know how expensive they are. Or you can get the one-off, offshoot volumes. But he's been notoriously late delivering work. He was with Image for a while doing a certain number. I don't know if it was like 25 through 35, and then went back to being independent. But really an interesting one for me because you don't hear about it a lot, but it's very influential. Like every cartoonist knows Jeff Smith. Everybody knows how brilliant of an artist he is and, this amazing creation. And, he's had a huge impact on the industry, but you don't hear about it a lot. So I'm hoping the Netflix show will change that. Similar to now Stan Sakai's Usagi Yojimbo has a Netflix series coming out too. And I also wonder if that's going to put Usagi on the map because that's another one that I feel like is like Bone, kind of underrepresented and, just not even underappreciated, just underknown. I just don't think people know about it. So I was excited. We'll never do a Bone topic, I don't think. So I was excited. Well, not this Bone topic.
Oh! But yeah, it's funny, man, because with comics with you, I have actually really specific memories. And I think the reason is because we just didn't interact with comics very much together. I have one memory of going to a show with you. It might have been one of these Holiday Inn type deals or whatever. And picking through boxes. Mom was with us and I was buying G.I. Joe comics, but they were like the old G.I. Joe comics, and they were like worthless. I think that's why Mom bought them for me. And then I also remember you giving me some copies of X-Men when I was probably in 2nd or 3rd grade. And the one I remember specifically was Psylocke was on the cover. And I know you loved her. And that was a character I was always attracted to long before I was like, into sex because she had katana, she's sexy, but she has a katana and all that kind of stuff. We love ninjas and we love our, katanas and all that kind of stuff. So those are like very specific memories I have. But other than that, I don't know very much about comics and I'm not attracted to it as a medium for me. I don't know why. I don't know. There are too many other things that catch my eye, I think. And I just don't know that I like that medium. As I've said so many times, like I would rather read a novel of Batman than read a comic. Like I think it would be cooler to read a Tom Clancy-esque X-Men story than the comics, just because I'm not even sure I'm reading it right. I don't know what I'm looking at, like what's important. To me, it's like I'm flipping through it. I remember Greg Miller lent me some Superman comics back in the day, and I was like reading through them. I'm like, am I reading these right? Because like I don't care, like
it's just completely.
Am I supposed to be analyzing this page for 30 seconds? Am I supposed to just be reading the text? I don't really see any, so I was always questioning what I'm supposed to be doing, when I'm reading comics. I know I'm overthinking it, but because like I'm done with it in 5 minutes, and I'm like, that was it. Like, and then you wait next month and you pay $3 more for another comic. But it's because I'm not looking at it the right way.
Right. I think that's a fair point. Actually, I never thought about that before because it's not like watching a film or taking in a TV show. There's only one way to do it, with your eyes open and paying attention, right? I mean, or not, whatever. But with a comic book, it is like, what am I supposed to focus on? What pace am I supposed to be going at? There are a lot of questions there. You're also a guy who I give a lot of credit to because you didn't back your way into traditional comic books in the Marvel universe or the DCEU, where you backed your way in through the films. And there's nothing wrong with that, where it's like you familiarize yourself. A lot of people our ages familiarize themselves with the comics through just watching the movies. And then they get a sense of what these things were all about that they were missing if they weren't on board for the comics back then. Where you didn't really do that. You haven't done that.
No, I've again seen one Marvel movie, and it's Iron Man. which is the first one,
which
as far as I understand.
That's amazing.
That's it. That's all of the ones I've seen. And I liked Iron Man. I thought it was great. I like that character, actually.
It's a great movie.
I love the playboy, like, billionaire, you know, with his armor and shit. I think it's super cool. I mean, I love Batman too, but yeah, I'm very cognizant of being a poser. I know that's a very gatekeepy sort of thing. I'm not putting it on anyone else. I'm putting it on myself.
Right.
I kind of feel like, and I feel this way, I mean, I've said it in Final Fantasy VII, like if you played Final Fantasy VII Remake without playing the original, you're a poser. I mean, whether or not you wanted to do that or not, that's cool. But you're a poser, right? And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with me where I'm like, I'm not going to spout off about this shit because I don't have the interest in doing it. And I feel like people come to me for being genuine. You know, I really love something if I'm talking about it positively. I never want to blow smoke up something's ass. So that particular medium I find really fascinating from a business standpoint, from a creative standpoint. It's been fun watching Marvel go from bankrupt to what they become in 25 years. That. I think that's amazing. But
sure.
I don't know. It's not for me. Yeah. So
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, Dave, the next one I wanted to talk about is the way we played outside. And here's where I'm going to bring up two products that were incredibly important to me growing up. And I actually looked up the dates to these because I felt like these were really right up my alley at the right time. And so they were. So when we play outside, and we've talked about this in the past, you know, we had water guns and all those kinds of things. Famously, we had an awesome Uzi water gun that looked indistinguishable from an Uzi, like would never in a million years be sold today. It didn't even have an orange tip on it or anything. Like, I can't believe that they sold the shit. And you would pop the clip into it. It was amazing. And it made noises. But I wanted to talk specifically about two products that I felt like changed the way I played outside. One was the Super Soaker, came out in 1990, and the other were Nerf guns. Now, I looked this up because Nerf has existed since the 70s, but people will remember that it was really like Nerf basketball, and then they came out with like footballs and stuff like that. Then in the late 80s, and I looked up this timeline because I was like, I feel like they came out with the bow and arrow. Now, I remember that was awesome. And they had like, remember the swords with like the things around them, and you can poke the other person's sword, you know? And so... And so 1992 is when Nerf guns came out, and like guns you would shoot, like a pistol or whatever. So those two things together, I feel like were really important items for me. I remember getting my Super Soaker 50s. I had two of them. Remember, they were the orange and yellow ones. They were almost like sidearms. Then you had the Super Soaker, I think 100, which was the green and yellow one. And they were amazing, and like they felt so different, and they were playable. Not so you can play with them inside without water. You can play with them in the pool. You can play with them in the yard. I loved that. And then I loved the Nerf stuff because we had the sword and we had the bow and arrow and even the gun that shot balls. But it was the Nerf guns with the ends where they would stick or they would have Velcro on them or whatever. I felt like it was very emblematic of that time when I was in elementary school and going into middle school, where everyone had a few of these laying around the house and they'd become kind of incorporated in whatever you were doing and whatever you were playing with. And I'm especially keen on the Super Soaker because I feel like I really remember that coming out. Like I remember, and I was reading about it. So I saw this in the past, but I think it actually might have most recently seen it in Black History Month. The creator of the Super Soaker, I think, is this random black dude who had been trying to sell it for many years. And he was like an engineer or something. And he went to Toy Fair in 1989, apparently, and sold it. And finally got it to market in 1990. And I remember the commercials on Nickelodeon and during the Saturday morning cartoons and how they would come out with these increasingly more audacious ones until they came out with like ones with backpacks. And I loved it. And then the Nerf guns, it was so cool. Like the Gatling guns and all of that. It brought a tactile kind of play that I feel like might be the last era of that in a time where they weren't really competing with electronics per se. I mean, you had your NES and your SNES, maybe you had your Game Boy and your TV and stuff like that, but you didn't have the internet really, weren't really competing with these other things. So it was like kind of the last era of that good old fashioned fun, that outdoor summer, springtime fun. And I feel like that kind of stuff changed a lot as I grew up too. And you can kind of see the evolution of that into the late 90s and these things kind of waning in importance as other toys that I'm not familiar with came to fruition. So I had to give a shout out to the way that we played outside and specifically the Super Soaker and the Nerf guns, because those were really, that was my shit. And it was like, that was my generation's stuff.
Yes, exactly.
So it was kind of cool. I had to give a shout out to those.
That's awesome, dude.
Do you remember the guns though that we had? I'm sorry. Do you remember all the super soakers that we had and we used to play with in the pool?
Of course. Yeah. Absolutely. That's where it started for me because, and it actually means a lot. This speaks volumes because both super soakers, various iterations, and they're always evolving and changing and improving. I guess improving, although a lot of people like to go after the original ones. I guess they're nostalgic now. And Nerf guns, that's still a big thing. Now you have branded Nerf guns with Zombie Strike and all these different cool things that they could do and all these different offshoots and iterations and add-ons and scopes and all this crazy stuff, and they shoot further and further. Those are two big. I mean, we talk about Lego taking over in the toy aisles and in kids' hearts and minds, but very much so, Super Soaker and especially Nerf are still huge things. So the fact that kids are still playing with those today in the face of like tablets and video games and not really wanting to go outside as much and all that kind of stuff, I think really means a lot. I mean, Graydon has like he has a complete like collection of, especially not so much Super Soakers. He has a few, but he's really into the Nerf guns. I mean, he really has like so many of them.
An arsenal.
He has an arsenal. Yeah. A complete arsenal of Nerf guns. And some he keeps outside and some he keeps inside. I've learned one thing about Nerf guns. Buy the Nerf brand darts because they're easily lost, especially outside. If you go to Five Below and get like, the pack of 40 darts for $6 or whatever, it's not the guns that hurt. It's the quality of the rubber and the foam that's not Nerf brand, that those off-brand darts hurt. I mean, like they really do hurt.
Chinese off-brand.
It's like, oh shit, like you have a red mark for weeks.
Dude, I remember
I've learned that.
Losing the arrows was the worst because they would only come with like 2 or 3 arrows each, and then mom and dad would just never buy me more. Like, what was really the big deal? Like, why wouldn't you just buy me more arrows? Like,
just get more arrows.
Like, what is because it was almost like you cannot lose under any circumstances. Can you lose these arrows because they are not getting replaced? And inevitably,
isn't that so funny? And those were big. Now they have not just the darts, but they have the balls, and then now the newest thing I think is the discs, the foam discs, which probably go far, but they're tinier too, which means a lot. But what I was going to say too, Kyle, was the Super Soaker in your generation that we grew up with, like you're talking about those automatic Entertech guns, which are like collector's items now because they look like real M16s or real Uzis or whatever.
They're fucking they're ridiculous. They're so awesome.
Funny, dude. And there's no way. You're right. I mean, there's just no way.
Dude, you get kills when you were using those today.
No, there's no way. And that was before the orange barrels and all that kind of crazy stuff.
That's what I was saying. Like the Uzi, I still have it, and it is literally just a black Uzi.
It's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Rob a bank with that thing.
Yeah,
it's so crazy to think like that was a thing back then. But before that, we had like the dime store or the drugstore water pistols, or just playing guns and like, oh, I got you. No, I jumped out first. Like the cool thing about Nerf and Super Soaker was it solved all that. You could really hit people.
Definitely.
So it was a game changer.
Because they were also those primitive. They almost looked like the Sega Master System blasters. Remember they had like that really early primitive laser gun game.
Yeah,
too. I remember
the
Contras had that. Yeah, it was like the original one, and like that was like kind of getting to a place where you wore like a helmet and like a chest plate.
Was it Photon? Did they have Photon?
Yeah, something
like that.
Yeah, it was something like, I don't know. I just love thinking about the cost benefit analysis of getting like a Nerf pistol and then losing the darts, and that was like the end.
That's so mom and dad.
Or you had like one, so you had to like shoot it and then go get it. Thanks, mom and dad.
And then the person can just be babysitting it, like just sitting there next to them. Exactly. You want to go get it, but you can't. Oh, that's so funny, dude.
All right, Dave, what's your last memory?
All right, my last one. So I got a pick here. Now I have a video game.
We can always do another one of these episodes too. So
yeah, we could do it. We could definitely do another one.
Yeah,
I was going to talk about Harry Potter. But it came, of course, Harry Potter came in 97. I didn't start Harry Potter until 98.
Sorry.
You were so young to be coming in 97. It's disturbing. It's disturbing.
Yeah, go on. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Don't talk about Hermione. Don't talk about her. It's kind of between a movie and a game here because we're gonna talk about Harry Potter at some point.
Yeah,
it's
I would
inevitable.
imagine so. Yeah,
it's inevitable.
I'd like to do that.
Let me talk about a video game. since you guys out there seem to like that.
I know they prefer that. Yeah.
You guys seem to like that best. Now, this was a tough one for me, Kyle, obviously, to boil down thinking about one 90s video game. I mean, 16-bit games, which are, Super Nintendo, Genesis, even glorified 16-bit like TurboGrafx. That generation of game is still very near and dear to my heart in terms of an era or a genre of gaming. I love 16-bit gaming. So all of that, Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Zelda Link to the Past. There's so many to name there. And then, of course, like other great ones like Symphony of the Night, Wild Arms, like Final Fantasy VII, like where do we go? So I'm going to go to the arcade. I'm going to go to a fighting game, but it's one I haven't talked about too much yet. And one that had a huge impact on me. And not Street Fighter, not Mortal Kombat, but Samurai Showdown or Samurai Spirits, the first one from SNK/Neo Geo. First game came out in 1993 that we got a Samurai Showdown in the arcades here on our red game, Neo Geo game consoles, that hopefully Samurai Showdown was included in there somewhere.
Yes.
But
World Champions, what was that? Or World Heroes. That was the other
World
one, right?
Heroes.
Yeah.
I hated that game. I hated that game so much because every time there was a Neo Geo cabinet, I would go over like where we skated a lot in Rockville Center. There was a bowling alley and they had a Neo Geo cab. And I think they had like World Heroes, Jet, and one of the Metal Slug games. And I was just like, this is unforgivable. How can a Neo Geo not have Samurai Showdown on it? So when Samurai Showdown came around, it was like a blessed gift from God for me. I mean, that's the impact it had on me. So we already were in love with Street Fighter 2 at that time. It's also important to remember, not only did me and my friends like PJ love fighting games, but we had Street Fighter 2, we had already Championship Edition and Hyper Fighting and Turbo and all that kind of stuff. So we were already at the point where like Chun-Li was throwing fireballs. Like we weren't too far off from like the new challengers at this point. And then of course Mortal Kombat was in the arcades, but I really wasn't a fan of Mortal Kombat because at that time it felt so different. Blocking with a button. I really wasn't on board for the digitized graphics. I thought it was a little corny. I actually think Mortal Kombat's pretty cool now, but back then I just wasn't, I was in front of the Street Fighter cabinet, no matter what,
Certainly.
When Samurai Showdown came out, I was like, what the hell is this shit? Because I saw a 2D fighter that was just taken to the next level off of what, you got to remember, this is before Street Fighter Alpha. Street Fighter Alpha wasn't too far away, but what sucked me in was the gorgeous graphics, the better animation. There was more colors than Street Fighter. And of course, the character designs were very, very anime. Now, I think it's fair to say Street Fighter was sort of a watered down or diluted anime style. It was from Japan, but it was a little more accessible. It was a little more Americanized. And I think they did that on purpose. Now, Capcom would famously later on, ramp up their art direction and take it to the next level with Darkstalkers and Marvel vs. Capcom. I mean, that's the best iteration of Marvel characters for me. I mean, gorgeous art direction. But back then, you have to remember, I think the anime thing started to kick off with new challengers when you had Cammy and Fei Long and stuff like that. But at that point, they hadn't really done that yet. So here was a 2D fighter that was, had all these interesting mechanics introduced. It was enough like Street Fighter where it was welcoming, but you had the anime graphics, you had characters with blue hair. It was just, the art direction they were more angular. The art direction was a little more inventive, was a little more bold, and they were fighting with weapons. And they had a rage meter, which means that they got stronger the more they got hit. So if you were losing the battle, you had kind of a shot in the arm because your character would be more powerful if you could only get a hit in. And then they had the parry meter where you clashed. And then instead of, where that in Street Fighter, that was always an interesting thing because if two players sort of had a similar command at the same time, let's say they both medium kicked around the same time, the AI would have to step in and decide who got the hit. But in Samurai Showdown, if that happened, you would clash, and then whoever lost the button mash would drop their weapon. So it had all these really interesting mechanics, but it was at the same time, in a way, funnily enough, pretty samey. Like, for instance, they had a green monster character that had a primary roll attack. Like things that I know Capcom took great exception to, and why Capcom made the Dan character was in anger against SNK at the time, which I always thought that was a joke, but when I researched it, no, Capcom was pissed at that time, and they had, in fact, I think they had just gotten off of bringing Data East to court and getting a lot of money out of Data East for Fighters History.
Yeah, Fighters History, right?
The first Fighters History game. Well, Capcom basically like gutted them. And so they went after SNK with the Dan character and stuff like that. But SNK was doing a lot of really awesome things with Samurai Showdown. The scaling, the way the camera would go in and out. It was the first fighting game to come along besides Mortal Kombat that could really hold a candle to Street Fighter. And, for me, dude, I mean, I played it daily. I would go to Sunvet Mall on Long Island daily with PJ. We would go see Fat Eric, who worked at that arcade, and we would go play Samurai Showdown. PJ was on board for more, he liked Mortal Kombat. He played Street Fighter. He played Samurai Showdown too, but I was just in front of the Samurai Showdown machine. And later on, of course, Samurai Showdown 2, I think, would come into it would just perfect everything awesome about Samurai Showdown 1. And I think all the subsequent iterations were cool, but Samurai Showdown 2 was like the perfect fighting game. In fact, I just learned that they still have tournaments in Japan with, centering on that game, which is awesome. But Samurai Showdown just took, it was such a treat for an anime fan at that time. It was like really playing an anime for me. It was the first game. There would be a lot of games after that were playing an anime, but that was like the first time in the arcade where it was like, it really felt like playing an anime. It had that, it was set in that feudal Japanese environment where very traditional with the shrines and, the really classic Japanese motifs, but also took that fantasy element where it exaggerated things. It exaggerated characters. It exaggerated the size of their weapons, their outfits, but grounded it in this feudal, Japanese setting with a conflict and a story and character interactions. It was really, for me, like maybe the most impactful game of the first half of the 90s, at least for me, where it inspired my drawing. It inspired the things I wanted to work on. And, for me, just like, one of the, really maybe even a little underrated, it seemed like at that time. Like there weren't the huge crowds around the Samurai Spirits machines to the degree of like Mortal Kombat, certainly, and the Street Fighter iterations, and even the the Marvelverse series later on, and Darkstalkers and stuff like that. Where it was like, I feel like Samurai Spirits was a little underappreciated. Then when I moved to Philly, there was a contingent of guys that were indestructible at Samurai Showdown, like those people you would face in Street Fighter, especially like living in California and like facing like all these guys that were amazing at it. But that was the first time living in Philly where it was like, okay, there's a small population of people that take this game really seriously, and they're like, unbeaten at the game. And I learned a lot from playing, and would take my breaks from art school. There were so many arcades at that time in the mid 90s on Chestnut Street where I went to school. So I would pop into the arcade on my lunch breaks and play and get inspired. And I fell through that game too. I fell in love with Neo Geo and its capabilities, and famously not buying that Neo Geo console from the guy working at the arcade that was going to sell it to me for so cheap, and just so many great memories that are just so emblematic of that time period. Really beholden to that one place in time where a game like that seemed so advanced to me. It was like, whoa, like so far flung from what we could even have on consoles at the time, because I didn't know anybody with a home console Neo Geo. And also, like, this was before the Saturn really took off, which was sort of tailor-made for 2D fighters and stuff like that. I still don't have a proper Saturn. But what do you think? Like, what was your experience with Samurai Showdown? And specifically, it's also important to note, it's not Neo Geo or SNK's first fighter. Art of Fighting and Fatal Fury were already out. So Samurai Showdown was another sort of attempt for them to catch lightning in a bottle with a fighting game and take a little piece of that sweet Capcom action. What was your earliest memories of all that SNK stuff?
I remember just playing all the Neo Geo stuff with you at the arcade at Ground Round and all of that. In hindsight, I think that the reason the SNK fighters were kind of hobbled, and other good SNK games too, like Magician Lord and all that, yeah. I think they were hobbled because they insisted on keeping them on their own console, and the console was over $1,000. It's a totally ridiculous value proposition, and it's unfortunate because those games are great, and
God, so good.
They They do later get ported to other consoles, of course. And Samurai Showdown, I mean, the new Samurai Showdown game just came out. So, I mean, the series is still going, but it's too bad because it was just the Acclaim and Capcom's willingness to play with the massive console manufacturers that proliferated that game. Because if Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat lived or died only on its arcade appearance, then I don't think it would have gotten any bigger than Samurai Showdown. It wasn't necessarily any bigger. Those games got big when, truly big. Of course, Capcom was manufacturing a ton of machines, but it got truly big when it went home on SNES and Genesis, specifically SNES. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well. But
it's a good point.
Also, Poppy!
Go, Poppy!
Almost surprised you didn't name your dog Poppy. Yeah, that would have been an interesting
That's
name
a deep cut. That would be cool. That's actually a good one. I don't know if I ever thought of that before.
That's, of course, Galford's dog in Samurai Showdown, or his husky, right? So,
yeah.
I love SNK. And the only problem with SNK now is, and very dramatic, although no one is really talking about it because the games press is so fucking stupid for the most part, is SNK is being basically bought out by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's a really bad dude.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you should go read about it.
I will.
Mohammed bin Salman, or whatever his name is, he bought, I think, 1/3 of it already, and I think he's going to buy the other 2/3 this year or next year.
I wonder what put that on his radar.
He's apparently a huge gamer.
Well, that would be it.
Yeah, but it's just bad news. He's the guy that ordered the that famous recently in the last couple of years. There was that Saudi or that journalist that was killed by the Saudi Secret Service or whatever in another country, and then they all escaped or whatever. And he was apparently the one that ordered it.
Oh, wow.
So this is a pretty bad dude that's getting involved, and he's going to own these games. So
that's weird.
Yeah.
Things just got weird.
Yeah. So go read about it. Everyone out there, go read about it. It's true. And no one's talking about it because no one knows anything.
Holy shit.
In the games industry, apparently.
You think people would talk about that?
And I love your shout out to Dan too. I mean, it is true that Capcom did make Dan for that. And you and I didn't know that when we were fans of Street Fighter Alpha. We just loved Dan because he was ridiculous.
Oh, we
didn't know that they were literally making fun of SNK, which is true. It's 100% true. I mean, Dig, in a similar spirit, in a similar samurai spirit, I'll wrap mine up with, and I wrote here, just the 90s are emblematic of the spread and final indoctrination of culture, Western culture, into nerd culture. And it started to really be spread in the 90s. And you can go back, of course. It's really fun to think about. Like, there were nerds in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. You actually see a little bit of it in The Patriot when the kid is painting his toys, right? Like painting his figures. There were these really arcane war games people used to play and all this kind of stuff. And it was like something that was actually for gentlemen and generals and officers and everything. And then it kind of in the 19th century became this thing that was starting to spread out. And people started playing board games and like the landlord's game, which became Monopoly and all that kind of stuff. And all these things started evolving. And by the time we got into the 20th century, and then after World War II, especially, this is when things started to gain hold. One of the first computer games was a supercomputer game called Space War that was basically based on Star Trek, and it was played with punch cards, and it was totally ridiculous, and that's totally inaccessible, right? And then in the 70s, we started getting home consoles, but you kind of needed a cable jack to even be able to receive the signal and all of that. And then in the 80s, we started getting, or in the late 70s into the 80s, we started getting computers. But, an Apple Lisa was $10,000, an Apple IIe, or, whatever, these things were really expensive, and IBM PCs. So the accessibility question still kind of continued. And I loved how you brought up like DOS games, because it really was like this mystical energy around it. Someone put a disc in, there was like this prompt. It didn't tell you anything, especially for console gamers. It was like, what the fuck is this? And then you typed it in, and sometimes you like turn the disc over, and like, it was like all this weird stuff. And so it was just inaccessible. But I feel like in the 90s is when things started to kind of happen. And there are some weird touchstones. Like, this is like kind of when Stargate started, right? And like all these weird kind of Farscape and Star Trek Next Generation is moving into the 90s and all that. So there's these little sci-fi kind of nuggets planted, right? And then you have things like Xena and all of that are kind of like planting little fantasy, sexual fantasy, but also fantasy stuff, right? And then you kind of start putting all of these things together. And I actually wrote down what I felt like were the most emblematic products of the 90s that really started to make things mainstream in some different ways. I think a major one, first of all, was, and working backwards, was episode 1. And you and I have talked about this. The lead up in 1999, May 1999, for episode 1, Star Wars episode 1, was so mainstream that it felt like Star Wars was becoming an acceptable thing. And in fact, it was. Star Wars is almost its own thing in the 70s and 80s. It's apart from sci-fi in a lot of ways because it's not high, like, sci-fi where it's like real technical. And it's also not like the movie schlock that people had. So it was its own thing.
Yeah.
And with episode 1, I felt like that was one of the calling cards of us getting mainstream acceptance of our culture in some way. This was also when Peter Jackson openly started working on the Lord of the Rings stuff. And so I think that also that didn't come out until 2001, but I think that's also when it started to kind of seep out into the ether as well. I think in video games, there are a few games that are really important to making nerdy games acceptable. It's not Mario and even Zelda and stuff like that. There are 2 games I think that are really important to this decade. One of them is Final Fantasy VII, 1997, that made RPGs mainstream. And it's not just role-playing games. It's the idea of like making gamers understand statistics, dice rolls, and all the equipment and all these things that are kind of second nature even to basic video games today. But back in the day, it wasn't. Like, we play Mega Man, for instance, you would be able to figure out who was not or who was immune to weapons because they would bounce off of them or they wouldn't do as much damage. But you kind of had to do the math for yourself. And these kinds of games, we knew for a long time that it was about, like, raising your strength and your hit points and grinding and all this kind of stuff. Introducing this stuff to people, I think, was a major step into making video games more accessible to people. And then the other one is even bigger, 1998's Pokemon, which I feel like was a massive hit that started with children and started with the cartoon, and it started very quietly, but we're in 2021 recording this and Pokemon's literally bigger than ever. And it started at that time. And the other thing that I needed to point out here, Dig, that I think were important to the kind of mainstreamization, as it were, of nerd culture. D&D started in the 70s. D&D version 2 came out in the 80s. And these were still underground kind of things. Dagan knows and I know. We see it on Stranger Things and stuff. This wasn't something that people were playing, right? But slowly, D&D started to not only infest video games, like we said with the role-playing games, but I think it created a more accessible version of the role-playing game for people, still big today, which is the customizable card game. And I feel like the spawning of that in the 90s, specifically with Magic in 93 and 94, and then later you got the Star Wars customizable card game in 96, 97, and Pokemon in the late 90s, these were massive to it's almost like the sports nerds. It had a way for them to be like, it bridged the gap between like the jock who would collect his baseball cards and then the nerd who would collect his Magic cards, and kind of realizing there's an inherent value in both of these things. And not only a market value, but a value in the way you interact with them. And in fact, it takes it a step further because these are cards that you play with. So it's not just reading the back and identifying the statistics like Kevin and, Kevin Arnold does on Wonder Years or whatever, So I feel like those are the different things that kind of contributed to a culture of acceptance that by the time we got to 1999, Star Wars Episode 1, we are a light year away from something like from Seagate or it's the Sequest and all of the weird shit that they started to try in the 90s that didn't really take or hold in some different ways. But then we started getting like Independence Day in the mid 90s. And so, you know what I mean? It's almost hard. I really do feel like it's hard for people to get how unacceptable it was in mainstream culture to be a nerd. And I've said over and over again, I also feel like Lost was one of the first shows that really did this, but that was in the 2000s where it was like, wow, there's like this meta, you're watching a sci-fi show and you don't know, you have sorority girls watching sci-fi. They don't know it. And it was, and I feel like Lost was that, but that came a little later. Yeah. We still needed to kind of sprinkle it in a little bit. And I feel like it was done in a lot of effective ways in the 90s. And without any of those, even with comic conventions and Icon and the all the things we used to go to, I feel like it was still this other world. And now you go to Comic-Con or PAX or E3 or whatever, and it's, everybody's there. So I feel like in some ways I miss that. It's not a gatekeeping kind of thing. It's like, I like the rarefied nature of being the guy with the Toy Fair magazine or the dude with the inside knowledge on the role-playing game or whatever. But at the same time, like, it's allowed us to live the life we live today. And it's kind of cool to see culture absorb our culture, but also know in our hearts, like we were there before it was acceptable.
Yes.
And that's simply impossible. For as awesome as it is that your son, for instance, at 10 years old, plays Mega Man and he loves all these different Shovel Knight and all that kind of stuff, he'll never really know what it was like to when it was like total, no one knew what the fuck Mega Man even was. It was impossible you were ever going to find a Mega Man fan.
It's so true.
So yeah, what do you think about that?
It's such a crazy notion to think about. It's a great thing to talk about in the 90s because there were so many inroads being made, although we didn't recognize how far it would come to today. And it's hard to imagine, a time where you look about today, right now, the MCU and the size of things like Star Wars and all of its content and the size of anime, that there's like 3 networks just to watch anime on. What you think about the 90s was like when it was first starting to enter like the FHEs and being sold in video stores and stuff and that was just starting to seep in the 90s. So, and like you said, Magic the Gathering was a really important element, I think, for that too. And
Dragon
culture.
Ball coming to Cartoon Network is another huge one. I mean, that was a massive seminal.
That's huge.
I mean, DBZ is almost boring today in my mind, where it's like, who gives a shit? I understand that it's like, it's very important, Akira Toriyama. I'm not saying any of that. It's just like, it's the most vanilla anime possible. And yet it was, I remember being such a big deal when it came to Cartoon Network,
That was huge.
And exposed people to all the other things that they would then be exposed to. I mean, things that I don't know anything about, but I know that was people's kind of connection to Vampire Hunter D and to, Inuyasha and to whatever weird shit that they would watch later. And just like Pokemon was a connection to them, to the other like parallels like Yu-Gi-Oh and Beyblade and all the kind of shit that they would get into later. So it was it's interesting how it all began with these kind of really bold moves into the, customizable card games and D&D and all that. I love it. And it was a quainter time. It was a more interesting time.
I agree, Kyle. And there's such a charm, there's such a mystique to, I have that thing too, and it's not a gatekeepery thing with me. It's not a snobbishness even. There's just something that's so alluring about being into something that there's still a magic there. It feels like something that maybe the other guy doesn't know. There's just really a charm to that. And a little bit of the magic is taken out, like for me with anime, and I mean, it's an anime renaissance. There's beautiful work out there. There's more studios. There's more animators employed. There's so many positive things to say about it. There's, reworkings of classic things. We have more Evangelion to look forward to. I mean, there's so many wonderful things. We've had One Punch Man and we've had Attack on Titan and we've had wonderful things in the last 10 years, some of the best. But there's such a harkening back to a time where it's just so cool. It seems like when it's something smaller, when something's a little more subculture-y and niche-y, it feels like something a little extra that maybe you could introduce the charm of you maybe introducing it to somebody rather than everybody already knowing about it. That mystique is just so compelling. I think that's not, just down to me and you. I think that's just a humanistic thing of like wanting to, I don't know if it's wanting to be in at the ground floor of something or if it's wanting to, I guess when so many people love something, it takes away a little bit of that draw. It takes away a little bit of like, the thing of like, I'm just a little smarter than you. I just know a little extra. I just know a little something you don't. So I think there's something to be said for that era where that existed. Now it's like, even if something's new, it gets popular so quick because everything is so accessible that that sort of thing where there's only a small pocket of people that know about it for a certain amount of time, that's not really going to be a thing anymore now. Everything is just too readily digestible. It's there and it's there for everybody. And there's a lot of positives for that too, especially insofar as the people creating it, because they could get recognized faster. They could become successful faster. They could then use that as fuel to do more things. So there's a lot of positives with that.
Sure.
As well. Yeah, but from a fan perspective, we've lost that thing where it's like, I'm going to Icon and that's like 90% of comic book convention, but I'm going for that 10% of anime that not a lot of people know about. Now it's Comic-Con for a week in San Diego and like, the American comics and the toys and the designer toys and anime, everything's as big as the next thing. everybody knows about everything. So
yeah, it's strange. It's strange, and it's kind of the similar thing to what stopped me from watching Game of Thrones for so long. I mean, I watched it in the beginning, and then the bigger it got, I'm like, I find this annoying. Like, it's great, and I actually love it. I mean, when I went back and actually finished, I watched it all over again and finished. I mean, it's excellent. I mean, of course, it's a huge hit. It's excellent, but the whole zeitgeist around it annoyed the shit out of me. I hated it, and it's the same thing that's happening now with Mandalorian and WandaVision and all these things where I'm like, you're ruining it.
Yes.
Like, it's not like you're literally ruining the plot. I'm like, you're just too excited about everything. And I can't, I don't know. That was so not nerdy to me. That was the one difference that I feel like mainstream nerd culture has kind of bastardized our culture in some way. Was I don't feel like we did like everything. I feel like people were much more discerning back then, and I feel like they're far less discerning now. And that's weird because there's so much more to choose from. So you'd think you would be way more discerning today. You never, ever have to play a bad game, ever, or watch a bad anime or a TV show. You can never even stumble into them.
Right.
Unless you really wanted to. So that's the one thing that annoys me, where everyone's excited about everything. And I'm like, not everything is great. And we need to identify what is and what isn't. But of course, people are attracted to the good things too. And you had brought up not only we brought up Game of Thrones, but you had brought up Attack on Titan, which is just another great example of a thing that, I mean, that was even unimaginable 10 years ago.
Yes.
So that's how much, like, where there's an anime, people don't even want to watch the dub, and it's like normal people watching it on Crunchyroll or Funimation or whatever the fuck they're watching on. And that's the weird. I mean, even 10 years ago, that was unimaginable. So things still are changing, and the same thing with the success of shows like The Expanse and all of that. That's also unimaginable, so it's interesting to watch it all kind of happen. But yeah, I don't know. I enjoyed this episode very much.
It was super fun. I got to ask you a question.
Please.
It's so fascinating to me what you just said, and I have this too, and I know a lot of people have this, and I saw I think you and Dustin were talking about this, or maybe Dustin was tweeting about it, something with WandaVision, where, and I could see this too with my coworkers, especially the comic book guys and girls, and, particularly the Marvel fans, where it's like that excitement, that level of excitement, that really amplified level of excitement just sort of, washes away the gravitas for something. I don't know what it is. I don't know, again, if that boils down to just a humanistic, a human tendency where it's like, how good, it's like almost like a cynicism where it's like, how good can this thing possibly be? But what is your experience? Because it's interesting that you bring up Game of Thrones, because I had this experience with Game of Thrones finally watching the entire series last year, where I very grudgingly started watching it because I always heard how wonderful it was, how amazing it was. And I was just like, how, I had that feeling. I was like, inside, I'm like, how good can this thing possibly be? Fine. Sure. Let me watch it. And it was almost like that Star Wars thing where you go in with your arms folded and you're like, show me this piece of shit, And then quickly like, okay, yeah, I understand why everybody's in love with this thing. It makes sense. But pound for pound, through the years now with TV shows and movies and even games for you, do you find that you come down more on the side of like when you finally do embrace something and get around to watching it or playing it, do you come down on the side of, okay, I understand. It makes sense why everybody's worshiping this thing? Or do you come down on the side after giving it a fair shot and a fair shake? Do you come down on the side of like, what the hell were these people even talking about? Where do you come down more, in your experiences?
It's a great question. I think it's a coin flip for me personally, because I think there are times where I always try to keep an open mind. I think part of the service that I provide to the audience is that it's not a matter of discernment. It's that I'm more cynical, I think, than most people. I'm not one of the, like dudes making thumbnails on YouTube with my mouth agape, excited about the next announcement. That's not my style. It's cool if that's what you're into, but it's not what I do. And so there are times where I always tell people, I'm like, keep your expectations low or non-existent. I don't even think about a lot of games before they come out. Like, I'm really excited about Returnal, which is an upcoming Housemarque game. I really love that studio. I love everything they make. And I'm like, I'm excited to play it when it comes to PS5 in a couple of months, but I'm like, I haven't really thought about it too much. Like when it gets here, I'm going to play it. And when you keep your expectations just non-existent or low, then when something surpasses your expectations, it really floors you. And an example of that was last year. I mean, Final Fantasy VII Remake is fucking awesome. It's awesome. It's so good. It has no business being that good.
Yeah.
And it was because, I think part of it was because it's really good, but part of it was because I didn't think it was going to be good. And it wasn't that I was actively not thinking it was good. It was I wasn't even thinking about it until it came in and I downloaded it and I played it. And so I just feel like hype gains control too much, and people kind of conflate hype with excitement, and it's cool to look forward to things, but it's like the same thing you're seeing now with that TMNT Dotemu game that was announced, the arcade game that they're making. It looks awesome, but it's like, cool. They're the team for the job. I mean, you know, first of all, Tribute's a great studio. Dotemu brought Streets of Rage back last year and it was awesome. I mean, this is good stuff, but like, let's just see. I mean, it exists. We can look forward to it, but let's not go in with those expectations where you're going to be let down, because I'm almost never let down. And I think that that's kind of a healthy way to be. And then when you play a game like The Last of Us Part 2 or Ghost of Tsushima or Curse of the Moon or something like that, it's like, holy moly, man, this is the stuff, you know? And you don't go in expecting the world. And then, so that's kind of always the way I go into almost everything. It's very rare that I ever just am blindly excited about something. I think like Mega Man 11 was one of those games. And, you know, if they announced like a 2D Castlevania game, it would be one of those games. But that's like really rare. Yeah. And I feel like there are people that just are like that with everything.
Yes.
And I just can't stand it. Yeah. You know, how passionate can you be about every MCU movie, every DC movie, every Disney Plus show, every game that comes to PlayStation, every game that comes to Nintendo? It's like, give me a break, dude.
Yeah.
You know, I can't do it. And that's
I can't relate to that.
That's the only bad part about nerd culture taking over, is the hype culture. That is the bastardization of nerd culture.
Yeah.
And that's different, you know? So I don't know. So I'm about 50-50 on that. How about you?
That's a great point. You know, I don't know. It seems like usually when something's really hyped, I end up understanding the hype. I definitely went through that with Game of Thrones. I think I started even like back in the day but I even started Sopranos late. I remember having a feeling about Sopranos, like, how good can this possibly be? I've seen great, you know, organized crime pieces of fiction, Goodfellas, Casino, Godfather. I mean, I've seen them all, you know, so how great can this TV series be? And then it, you know, blew my mind expectation wise. I mean, the level of positivity that you're talking about, I admire, but the energy level is the energy level. Thinking about the energy needed for that sort of positivity is exhausting to me. I think I do have a little more cynicism than that. And
well, because it comes off as fake. No one can be that excited about
that's
everything.
What I'm wondering. Like, can that really be authentic? And I don't know. I might not just have that kind of positivity. It might not just be, you know, my thing. I might just not be capable of that kind of positivity where it's like I'm more centered. But, you know, I also think about things like One Punch Man, right? An anime series where like guys like Bill Burr are like, dude, like, you know, he makes fun of everything. He makes fun of nerds and anime and everything. He's like, I watch his show and it's like the best thing I've ever seen. So it's like that type of thing where it's like, and that's special. Whereas someone like Bill Burr is like coming off and saying like, oh, like I don't usually go in for this kind of crap. In fact, I'm kind of a little embarrassed to be associated with Star Wars. But like this animated series, One Punch Man, and I kind of grudgingly gave it a shot, and it's like the coolest thing I've ever seen. And I agree with something like One Punch Man. It's just really special. But if everything's special, then what's special? You know what I mean?
That's exactly
right.
That's the thing. Yeah, so. It's exactly right. Like, I can't stand it. And so that's why people come to me. If you want, you know, in us, it's like, if you want that stuff, you know, there's plenty of that, but maybe you are a little more discerning. Dagan, let's wrap it up.
That's fun, my friend. That was a fun one, my friend.
That was a good one. Hit me up with a dad joke.
Okay, I got one here for you, Kyle.
Yeah.
Kyle. Oh, wait, where'd it go? Hold on. That's not the one I want. I'm looking for it. There's a lot of dad jokes here to choose from, but I really wanted this specific one. I found a great site here, Colin.
God, you're just plagiarizing left and right. Look at you.
I am. I'm unapologetically.
I wrote you 2 perfectly good dad jokes this week.
See, now I didn't know. Don't ruin them. Don't say them here.
I won't.
I didn't know if you wanted me to use them because...
No. I just did it for you. I was just saying it to you and Allie on a thread, but yeah.
I appreciate it on that level for sure. But all right, let me do another one because there's so many good ones here anyway. I saw a good one here. Where was it, Kyle? I should have just read yours. See what happens.
I know, you're like wasting all this
I'm
time.
wasting all this time. There's all this dead air. Okay, let's do this one. Kyle,
Yeah.
what kind of car does a sheep like to drive?
I don't know.
A Lamborghini.
I should have wrote it. Yeah, that's a good. I like that one.
You do
I like that one.
I'm
Yeah, that's a pretty good one.
surprised.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Not bad.
That's good. Yeah.
Oh, I just
Always
closed
a
my
pun.
window and I see Wallace Shawn here. So another shout out to Wallace Shawn's big mug right here.
I know, it's huge. His huge face.
Just tie this show together, bookend it with Wallace.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I didn't even say anything at the top, but we're supported on Patreon, as I think most of you or all of you know at this point. Patreon.com/laststandmedia, early ad-free access to the show and all of the other shows we do. Watch us on YouTube if you want. Some of you are doing that there. We appreciate that. Free feeds, iTunes, Spotify, etc. I actually use Megaphone as our RSS feed to upload our shows, and Spotify just bought them, so I imagine that will be more closely integrated soon too. So I'll be interested to see that. I'll eventually be interested to see if we can start putting video podcasts on Spotify, which I think is not too far away.
That would be
as
cool.
well. So, all right. Anything else, Dig? We're not going to have you next week, but we'll have you the week after. And
Yes.
you'll have begun your new job.
I get a little break. Just one thing.
Jordy LaForge. Yeah.
Oh,
there
that's
he
good
is.
right there.
Yeah. Or Lobot. Whoa.
Or
It's a
Lobot.
little- yeah, there you go. Lobot. Lobot's awesome. Love Lobot.
It's the best.
He comes up
What does he
every
do?
episode, so he must be active.
What does he do? Does he do the one thing? I don't know. He does something.
He does
some
like-
iconic
Yeah,
gesture.
like he points or something. Like he walks up and
That's
he points, and I think they arrest. He stands there like, well, he's a great character because he's like an android, and we don't really see very much of that in Star Wars for some reason.
He doesn't
Anyway,
have to talk. He'd be
we'll
a
do a
terrible
whole
podcaster.
Yeah, he would be. He would be a
Okay.
terrible podcaster. He's also. It's also. I don't know. We'll do a whole episode on Lobot one day.
Well, we're really hurting for topics.
Yeah, we'll give
We'll
it a few
go in.
years.
We'll
and
do our Lobot episode.
do our Lobot episode, our IG-88 episode, all the others. All right, Dick. Well, I'll see you next time then. And thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of our show. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.
It's my heart.
KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.